There is a particular kind of man who is most dangerous, not because he is cruel, but because he is useful. A man who keeps his hands clean by ensuring that others do the dirtying. A man who attends the meetings, signs the requests, reads the reports, and then, when the accounting comes, looks across the courtroom with steady eyes and says, "I did not know." Albert Speer was that man. He was not a fanatic. He did not foam at rallies or dream of racial empires. He was, by every outward measure, a cultivated, intelligent, quietly charming architect from a good family who happened to find himself standing at the very center of the most destructive regime the modern world has ever produced. He designed its monuments. He fed its war machine. He sat at the Führer's table for 12 years, and when it was all over, when the cities were rubble and the camps were opened, and the world was still trying to comprehend what had been done, Albert Speer did something that none of his fellow architects of catastrophe managed to do. He survived, not merely physically. He survived in reputation. He survived in bookshops. He survived on television screens, in universities, in the careful, sorrowful prose of his own internationally celebrated memoir. He survived as the Nazi the world was allowed to almost understand. That survival was not an accident. It was, in its own dark way, a masterwork, as precisely constructed and as deliberately staged as the columns of light he sent soaring into the Nuremberg sky. And it is the full story of that construction, from the drafting table of a young man in 1920s Berlin to a hospital bed in London in September of 1981, that this documentary will follow, hour by hour, decade by decade, through the evidence and through the silences. If you are settling in tonight, finding your comfortable place, letting the noise of the day fall away, then this is a story worth accompanying you. It is long, it should be long, because the question at the heart of it is not simple, and it deserves the space to breathe. How much can a man know and still claim innocence? How much can proximity to power corrupt a person who considers himself decent? And how is it that the human capacity for self-deception can operate at the very highest levels of intelligence and education? That a man can be brilliant in one direction and comprehensively blind in another. These are not questions that belong only to the 1930s and 40s. They are questions that live right now, in every institution, in every organization, in every person who has ever looked away from something uncomfortable, because looking toward it would have cost too much. Speer's story is a mirror. What you see in it depends on how honestly you are willing to look. Take a slow breath. Settle your body down. You do not need to hold any of this tightly. Just let it come to you, at whatever pace finds you tonight. We are going to begin where all lives begin, in an ordinary house, in an ordinary city, with a boy who wanted very badly to please his father. From that beginning, we will trace every step. The lecture hall, where a charismatic professor changed how a young man saw the world. The cold Berlin evening in 1931, when Speer first stood at the back of a crowded meeting hall and watched Adolf Hitler speak. The extraordinary, almost inexplicable personal bond that formed between a failed painter turned dictator and a talented architect who had found the patron his ambition always craved. We will follow Speer through the years of stone and spectacle, the cathedrals of light, the granite parade grounds, the table drawings of a Berlin that would have been the most megalomaniacal city in human history, a capital called Germania, designed to announce to the world that a 1,000-year empire had arrived. We will watch him step, in 1942, from the drawing board into the Ministry of Armaments, an appointment so improbable that even his enemies laughed, And then we will watch those enemies stop laughing as tank output doubles and aircraft production climbs in defiance of Allied bombs. We will follow him into the machinery behind those numbers, into the vast grey world of forced labour and quarried stone and concentration camp workers. The world that Speer always claimed was running just beyond the edge of his vision, just far enough away for a gentleman to maintain his composure. We will sit with him in the dock at Nuremberg, watching him play the one role that none of the other 21 defendants had thought to play, the regretful man, the man who had reflected, the educated professional who had been seduced by power and now accepted, with apparent sincerity, his portion of the guilt. We will watch the tribunal deliberate. We will hear the verdict, not death, but 20 years, and we will listen to the sound of the world, slowly deciding what to make of Albert Speer. And then we will follow him into Spandau prison, where for 20 years he walked an imaginary road around the garden, counting his steps, calculating the distance, telling himself he was walking from Berlin to Kabul and back, kilometre by imaginary kilometre, while his pen, moving in secret, built the book that would set him free into history. Then the historians will arrive, patient, methodical, armed with documents, and one by one they will open the files that Speer had hoped the world would never read closely enough. This is a documentary that respects your time and your intelligence. Nothing in it has been invented. No quote has been fabricated. No document has been conjured. Where the record is clear, we will follow the record. Where it is ambiguous, we will tell you that it is ambiguous. And where it is damning, we will not look away. If you are new to this channel, this would be a very good moment to subscribe. We release long-form sleep documentaries like this one regularly. Deep, careful histories told at a pace that rewards patience, built for the hours when the world is quiet, and a story can actually settle into you, rather than flashing past. Hit subscribe, and you will not miss what comes next. And if you are already part of this community, welcome back. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. You are in for a long night with one of history's most complicated men. His name was Berthold Albert Speer. He was born on the 19th of March, 1905, in Mannheim, Germany. He died on the 1st of September, 1981, in London, England. Still, to the last hours of his life, managing the story. Between those two dates lies one of the most instructive and most troubling careers in the entire history of the 20th century. A man who built beautiful things for a murderous regime. A man who administered an empire of suffering and called it management. A man who sat across from history's worst crime and claimed, with a composure that never quite broke, that he had not seen it clearly enough to be held responsible. Whether you believe him, that is the question we are going to spend the next several hours with. The archive is open. The light is low. Let us begin. There is a particular kind of house that tells you everything about the family living inside it before you ever knock on the door. The Speer family residence in Mannheim was that kind of house. Broad, well-proportioned, set back from the street, with the quiet authority of a building that expects to be taken seriously. Albert Speer Sr. had built a successful architectural practice across the Rhine Valley, and the home reflected his professional standing with the same precision he brought to every commission. It was a house of surfaces, polished floors, ordered rooms, and a silence that sat between family members, like a piece of furniture nobody had chosen to remove. Into this household, on the 19th of March, 1905, a second son was born. He was given his father's name, almost as if the question of who he was supposed to become had already been settled. The elder Speer was not a cruel man in any dramatic sense. He was something quieter, and in some ways harder to navigate, emotionally absent in the way that prosperous professional men of the Wilhelmine era were trained to be. His world was drafting tables and client meetings, civic reputation, and the clean satisfaction of a building completed on time. Warmth was not among the tools of his trade, and he carried that limitation home with him every evening as reliably as his briefcase. For young Albert, the effect was accumulative rather than acute. Not a single wound, but a slow, persistent hunger for acknowledgement that would shape the entire architecture of his adult ambitions. He was a child who needed to be seen, growing up in a house where being seen required first being impressive. His mother, Wilhelmine, operated on a different frequency entirely. Where her husband was controlled and receding, she was socially energetic, attentive to status, and keenly aware of the family's position in Mannheim's bourgeois hierarchy. She dressed well, entertained carefully, and measured the world in increments of respectability. For the young Albert, watching all of this from the periphery, the lesson absorbed was precise and durable. The way to matter in the world is to produce something the world cannot ignore. Achievement was the currency of love in the Speer household, and he began collecting it early, performing well in school, demonstrating a facility with mathematics and spatial reasoning, and showing a quiet, almost unsettling focus for a boy his age. He was not rebellious. He was competitive in the direction of approval. The world outside the Speer household was not offering its own inhabitants much stability. Germany, in the years immediately following the First World War, was a country being taken apart and partially reassembled in ways that satisfied almost nobody. The armistice of November 1918 ended the killing, but opened something else. A long, disorientating argument about what Germany was, who was to blame for the catastrophe, and what kind of future was still possible. The Versailles settlement imposed reparations, stripped territory, and dismembered the old imperial military with a thoroughness that felt, to many Germans across the political spectrum, less like a peace and more like a punishment designed to last indefinitely. The republic that rose from the ashes of the Kaiser's empire was born fragile and contested, and it never fully recovered from being born that way. Mannheim and Heidelberg, the cities of Albert Speer's boyhood, were not insulated from this turbulence by their prosperity or their physical beauty. Inflation, when it came in the early 1920s, came for everyone. Middle-class families who had saved carefully for decades watched the value of those savings dissolve in months, then weeks, then days. The Speers were not ruined. Albert Sr.'s architectural work continued to provide income, but the broader collapse was visible on every street, in the shuttered shop fronts, in the men who had once held secure government positions, now selling goods from crates on pavements. For a boy from a household that measured its dignity in material order, the spectacle of a society losing its material footing was formative in ways that are difficult to overstate. Order, in the Germany of Albert Speer's adolescence, was not an abstract philosophical preference. It was something you could watch disappearing in real time. Architecture, when he encountered it as a discipline, rather than simply as the background of his father's professional life, offered something that the world outside could not. It was the art of imposing structure on space, of taking a site that meant nothing and building something on it that meant everything you chose it to mean. The aesthetic philosophy that would later capture Speer's imagination completely was one of rational clarity, honest materials, and human scale. The conviction that a well-built thing was a morally serious thing. But the deeper pull, beneath the intellectual framework, was simpler and more personal. Architecture was a language in which you could be entirely in control. You drew the lines, you determined the proportions, you decided what stood and what did not. For a young man shaped by emotional displacement and raised against a backdrop of national disorder, the appeal was not merely professional, it was psychological. He enrolled to study architecture at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, before transferring to Munich and, eventually, to the Berlin Institute of Technology, a trajectory that reflected his seriousness and his ambition in equal measure. He was a good student rather than a brilliant one in the early years, technically capable but not yet ignited by a guiding vision. That changed at the Berlin Institute, where he came under the influence of a professor whose ideas would mark him permanently. But that encounter belongs to the next phase of his story. What matters here is the momentum building underneath. A young man in his early 20s, moving through the intellectual world of late Weimar Germany with considerable facility, still largely indifferent to the political storms gathering around him, and focused, with the slightly narrowed attention of the genuinely driven, on the question of how to make something lasting. The Germany he was moving through in the mid to late 1920s was both electrifying and precarious. The Weimar Republic had stabilized somewhat after the inflation crisis, but the cultural ferment of Berlin, its nightlife, its artistic experimentation, its radical politics colliding in cabarets and on street corners, created an atmosphere of intensity that could be experienced as either liberation or threat, depending entirely on who you were and what you needed from the world. Speer, by his own later account, found the ideological noise of the period largely uninteresting. He was not drawn to communist ideas or to the various nationalist movements fighting for ground in the beer halls. He was, he would later say, a man of technical problems and aesthetic solutions, moving through a politicized landscape without catching the fever. How much of this self-portrait is accurate, and how much is retrospective convenience, is a question that will pursue his story all the way to its end. What is clear is that his family background gave him a specific set of defaults. He understood hierarchy intuitively. He respected professional authority. He was comfortable in rooms where decisions were made by the people who held power, and he had grown up watching his father navigate the relationship between client and architect with a quiet practicality, the man who builds what is commissioned, who serves the vision of the one who pays. This was not servility. It was professionalism as Speer understood it. The architect does not ask whether the patron's ambitions are reasonable. The architect asks how to realize them with maximum skill and minimum waste. It was a disposition perfectly calibrated for what was coming, though in the late 1920s, in his student rooms in Berlin, none of that was yet visible. The boy from Mannheim had become a young man of discipline, intelligence, and carefully managed affect, someone who presented well, who knew how to make himself useful to the people above him, and who had learned early that the world did not reward waiting to be noticed. He had absorbed his mother's attentiveness to the appearance of success, and his father's faith in the clean authority of a finished product. He lacked, by most accounts of those who knew him in these years, an interior life that made strong demands on the exterior world. He did not burn with causes. He did not rage against the chaos of the Republic. He was contained, capable, and moving purposefully in a single direction, toward the moment when his talent would find a stage large enough to justify the ambition he had been storing since childhood. That stage was closer than he knew, the Germany being born around him, bitter, proud, economically shattered and ideologically searching, was assembling an audience for spectacle on a scale that no previous generation had imagined. The disorder that had frightened young Albert Speer, the inflation and the humiliation and the grinding uncertainty of the post-war years, was producing in millions of his countrymen precisely the hunger for order, for greatness, for the clean authority of a vision, realized in stone and light, that architecture had always promised and rarely fully delivered. There was a man beginning to draw enormous crowds in the beer halls and rally grounds of Bavaria and beyond. A man whose genius, such as it was, lay entirely in his understanding of this hunger and his willingness to feed it without restraint. Speer did not yet know that man's name with any particular urgency. He would learn it soon enough, and the learning would cost him everything, and give him everything, and define every judgment that history would ever make of him. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a drafting room in the early hours of the morning. The scratch of a pencil across paper, the soft resistance of the rule against the board. For a young man, still assembling the pieces of himself, that quiet was not emptiness, it was order. And order, for Albert Speer, had always been the thing he reached for when the world outside felt too loud, too uncertain, too beyond his control. By the time he arrived in Berlin to study architecture at the city's foremost technical institute, he had already learned that buildings did not disappoint you the way people did. They answered to logic. They answered to line. They answered, above all, to the man who understood how to command them. He had not always intended to study in Berlin. His father had studied architecture. His grandfather had studied architecture. The profession ran through the Speer family like a load-bearing wall, structural, expected, and not entirely his own choice. But the city itself was something different. Berlin in the mid-1920s was a place of ferocious energy and equally ferocious instability, a capital still rattled by the aftershocks of war and revolution, where avant-garde ideas competed openly with reactionary ones, where the streets could feel like a theatre in which no one was entirely sure of the plot. For a young man who had grown up in prosperous, mannered Mannheim, it was an education in itself, even before he set foot in a lecture hall. It was inside those lecture halls that everything changed. The professor whose classes Speer attended, and whose influence would mark him most durably, was Heinrich Tessenow, a man of deep conviction and relatively modest fame, a figure who stood deliberately apart from the more fashionable currents of modernist architecture then sweeping through German design. Tessenow believed in restraint. He believed in craft. He believed that good building should express something honest about the people who would live and work inside it, that the clean line and the honest material were not just aesthetic choices, but moral ones. Where the Bauhaus movement was international and experimental, Tessenow was rooted, Germanic, deeply suspicious of ornament for its own sake. His lectures were spare and precise, and Speer absorbed them with the focus of a student who had finally found a teacher worth believing in. Tessenow noticed the young man from Mannheim. He had a quality that his professor valued, and that distinguished him from many of his peers. He listened. He did not argue for the sake of arguing. He did not perform cleverness. He sat with an idea until he understood it, and when he responded to it, he responded with care. Before long, Speer had become Tessenow's assistant, helping to prepare materials, attending seminars, acting as something close to a disciple. It was, in many ways, the first time in his life that a figure of authority had looked at him and found him sufficient. After years of his father's cold and measured approval, after a childhood in which achievement was the only currency that bought warmth. This was not a small thing. Speer gave Tessenow his full devotion, and Tessenow gave him a vocabulary, an aesthetic and ethical framework he believed would carry him through his professional life. What Tessenow's framework could not do was prepare his most attentive student for the world that was accelerating toward them both. The Germany of the late 1920s and very early 1930s was not the Germany of lecture halls and drawing boards. It was a Germany of street fights and mass unemployment, of political parties that resembled private armies, of a parliamentary system grinding toward its own dissolution. The Great Depression had hit hard. By the early years of the decade, millions were out of work. Savings had been annihilated within recent memory by the hyperinflation of the previous decade, and the moderate political center was being squeezed from both sides by movements that promised, in very different ways, to tear the existing order apart and replace it with something total. Most young architects kept their heads down and their politics vague. Speer, by his own account, was among them, curious about the noise in the streets, but not drawn to it, professionally absorbed, temperamentally cautious. Then a friend asked him to come to a rally. The precise circumstances were unremarkable. A fellow student, politically engaged in ways Speer had not been, suggested an evening out, framing it partly as curiosity, partly as an experience one ought to have, simply in order to understand what was happening in the country. The rally was a National Socialist meeting in a Berlin suburb, and Hitler was to speak. Speer was not an enthusiast. He was not, he would later insist, looking for answers that night, or for a cause, or for a leader. He was looking, in his own telling, the way a man looks at a painting he has heard discussed, but never seen, with informed detachment, the cultivated observer's preference for experience over prejudice. What he found was something he had not prepared for. The hall was packed. The crowd was not the rabble he might have expected, or so it seemed to him, but included students, professionals, people who looked, in the particular social grammar of the time, like people from his world. The atmosphere built slowly, through careful staging, through the manipulation of waiting and expectation, until by the time the speaker appeared, the room had already been turned into an instrument, and then Hitler spoke. Speer would describe the experience many times over the following decades, and his descriptions never quite lost the quality of a man trying to explain something that resisted explanation, the way a voice and a room and a moment can combine into something that bypasses rational assessment entirely and strikes at a register deeper and less defensible. He was not persuaded by arguments that night. There were, in his telling, barely arguments at all in the usual sense. What there was feeling, vast, orchestrated, collective feeling, directed and shaped with a precision that struck a trained eye for design, like the recognition of a masterwork. That was the mechanism, and Speer understood it as a mechanism even as it worked on him. He saw the stagecraft. He registered the manipulation of light and space and crowd and timing with the professional attention of a man who had spent years thinking about how built environments affect human experience. And rather than this recognition protecting him, it may have made him more susceptible, because what he was watching was, by any aesthetic measure, extraordinarily effective. The man at the front of the room was doing something Speer had been trained to value. He was using form to produce feeling, that the content of the feeling was political fanaticism, that the purpose was the acquisition of total power, that the people being swept along included the vulnerable, the desperate, and the dangerously primed for violence. None of this registered that evening with the weight it deserved. Speer processed what he saw as an architect processes a building. He admired the proportions and set aside the question of what it was built to contain. He joined the Nazi Party within weeks. The decision was characteristically precise in its framing and characteristically evasive in its substance. He was not, he would maintain, joining out of belief in the ideology. He did not think of himself as an anti-Semite or a nationalist in the narrow ideological sense, though his social world had always been quietly, unreflectingly shaped by the assumptions his class carried without examination. He was joining, as he told it, because something had moved him, and the honest response to being moved was to follow the feeling. It was an artist's justification, wrapped in the language of sincerity, emotion as exculpation, aesthetic experience as a category exempt from moral accounting. He would repeat some version of this claim for the next 50 years. The distinction he drew, emotional rather than political, aesthetic rather than ideological, was, on one level, genuinely felt. Speer was not a man who burned with racial hatred, or who read the party's publications with ideological hunger. He was a man who had found a patron class that appreciated grand ambition, and who had felt, for one charged evening in a Berlin suburb, that the future might have room for him in it. But the distinction was also, from the very beginning, a kind of shelter, a conceptual space in which he could participate fully in a movement while telling himself that his participation was of a different, cleaner order than that of the true believers around him. It protected him from the implications of what he was joining, and it would go on protecting him, or seeming to, long after the implications became inescapably clear. That evening in the rally hall was many things at once: a genuine personal experience, a seduction, a professional fascination, and the first step in a collaboration that would eventually place a quiet young architect with a pencil and a love of clean lines at the very center of a machine of enormous destructive power. But standing on the pavement outside the hall afterward, breathing the cold night air of a Berlin winter, Speer was simply a man who had felt something move in him, and who had not yet asked himself what that movement would cost. He was 26 years old. His greatest buildings were still ahead of him. So were his greatest silences. There is a particular kind of hunger that expresses itself not in greed, but in restraint. In the careful, almost reverential way a man holds himself back while waiting for the right door to open. Albert Speer had spent his young life cultivating exactly that posture. He was meticulous where others were flashy, technical where others were theatrical, and possessed of a cold interior ambition that he had learned, growing up in his father's silent house in Mannheim, to keep perfectly still. By the time he arrived in Berlin in the early 1930s, that door was beginning to open, and Speer, without fully understanding what lay beyond it, walked through. The commission that changed everything was, by any objective measure, a modest one. The Nazi Party needed some rooms in Berlin made presentable, walls repainted, a dining area refreshed, a headquarters that looked less like a converted building and more like the seat of a movement on the rise. Speer took the work because he needed the money. He was a young architect with talent and credentials, and no clients of consequence, operating in a German economy that had left the construction industry essentially barren. He completed the renovation quickly, efficiently, and with a sensitivity to atmosphere that went beyond mere decoration. The rooms looked correct. They projected the right weight, the right seriousness. Someone noticed. That someone was Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's Minister of Propaganda, and a man with an acute, almost pathological sensitivity to image. Goebbels understood better than almost anyone in the Nazi leadership that politics at the highest level is performance, that the way power looks is inseparable from the power itself. He commissioned Speer to renovate his own official residence, and satisfied with the results, did what powerful men with useful subordinates often do. He introduced him upward. The introduction led to Hitler, and what happened next was not the formal meeting of a minister and a functionary. It was something stranger and more consequential than that. Hitler had spent the early years of his life trying to become an artist. He had applied twice to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and been rejected twice. The wound had never fully healed. He still spoke about architecture and painting, with a familiarity that others in his circle privately found excessive, and he surrounded himself with artists, designers, and aestheticians in a way that suggested he was trying to complete, through proximity, something that had been denied to him directly. When he met Speer, young, technically brilliant, possessed of actual training and genuine craft, he encountered something he could not have anticipated, a man who spoke his language without flattery, who could translate the grandiose visions accumulating in Hitler's imagination into something that might actually be built. The chemistry between them was immediate and, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, genuinely striking. For Speer, the encounter was no less transformative. He had joined the Nazi Party, as he would later say repeatedly, in courtrooms and in print, not out of ideological conviction, but out of aesthetic excitement, drawn to the spectacle of a movement that seemed to be doing something with raw energy that no other political force in Germany could match. Meeting Hitler in person only deepened that seduction. Here was a man of absolute conviction, absolute authority, and, from Speer's particular angle of vision, absolute appetite for building. Hitler did not merely want structures, he wanted monuments. He wanted a physical world that would outlast him by 1,000 years, that would tell future civilizations the story of German greatness in stone and marble and open space. For an architect starved of commission and scale, this was not a political program. It was a brief. The first significant assignment was the redesign of the reception rooms at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The existing space was, by Hitler's reckoning, embarrassing. A set of provincial offices quite unsuited to the business of receiving foreign dignitaries and projecting the authority of a nation reborn. Speer set to work with the focused intensity that would become his professional signature. He met deadlines that others considered impossible, managed craftsmen and suppliers with an organizational precision that surprised even experienced contractors, and delivered rooms that satisfied Hitler's demands for grandeur, while retaining a disciplined architectural restraint that prevented them from tipping into vulgarity. Hitler was delighted. The relationship deepened. What consolidated it was Nuremberg. The Nazi Party held its annual rallies in the old Franconian city, mass gatherings of such scale and choreographic ambition that their organization alone represented an enormous logistical undertaking. Speer was handed responsibility for the physical staging of these events, the arrangement of banners, the design of the parade grounds, the spatial logic of crowds measured in the hundreds of thousands. He approached the task as an architect rather than a propagandist, which paradoxically made him a more effective propagandist than most. He understood that scale and proportion carry emotional weight, that the human body, standing in a carefully designed space, feels what the designer intends it to feel. The rally grounds at Nuremberg were not merely large, they were engineered to produce awe. But it was at night that Speer reached for something that no one had attempted before. For the rally of 1934, the one that Leni Riefenstahl was simultaneously filming, for what would become one of the most studied works of cinematic propaganda ever made, Speer conceived what he called the Cathedral of Light. 130 anti-aircraft searchlights, borrowed from the Luftwaffe, were arranged in a vast rectangle around the Zeppelin field and aimed vertically into the sky. When they were switched on simultaneously after dark, they threw columns of blue-white light 8 kilometers into the atmosphere, creating the impression of an enormous luminous architecture, walls of light enclosing the crowd, a ceiling somewhere above the clouds. Inside this structure of pure illumination, tens of thousands of people stood in near silence, looking upward. The effect was unlike anything that had been seen in modern political spectacle. It was not fireworks. It was not decoration. It was architecture made of light, temporary, unrepeatable, and yet more powerful in its impression than anything built in stone. Sir Neville Henderson, the British ambassador to Germany, attended the rally and later wrote that it was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. The phrase that circulated in the international press was immediate and lasting. The Cathedral of Light. Speer was 30 years old. He was, overnight, not merely a party functionary with a talent for interiors, but an internationally recognized creative force, a man who had staged something that the world was still talking about days later. Hitler's response to the Cathedral of Light was something that went beyond satisfaction or approval. It confirmed for him what he had already begun to feel, that Speer was not merely useful but essential, the one person in his circle who could take the shapeless enormity of his ambitions and give them form. The private access Speer had been granted began to expand into something more personal. There were late evenings in which the two men sat together over architectural drawings and models, Hitler sketching proposals with an enthusiasm that Speer would later describe as childlike in its intensity. Speer listening and translating, and occasionally, carefully, redirecting. They shared meals. They shared silences. To those watching from a distance, the relationship looked less like a dictatorship's patronage and more like a friendship, or the closest thing to friendship that a man like Hitler was capable of sustaining. This was not, it must be said, without its dangers, the specific dangers that attend any proximity to total power. Others in the Nazi hierarchy watched the Speer-Hitler relationship with a mixture of resentment and calculation. Speer was young, politically inexperienced, and held no formal party rank of significance. He had arrived through aesthetics rather than ideology, through taste rather than loyalty, demonstrated in the years of struggle. The old guard, those who had marched through the early 1920s, who had been to prison, who had built the movement from nothing, did not always accept the favorite architect as one of their own. Speer noticed this and filed it away. He was becoming, without quite planning to, a political creature as well as a creative one. What is perhaps most revealing about this period is not what Speer built, but what he allowed himself not to see while he was building it. The Germany of the mid-1930s was not a place where the regime's character could be mistaken by anyone paying attention. The laws stripping Jewish citizens of their rights had been passed. The concentration camps had been open for years. The violence of the streets, the arrests, the disappearances, the systematic destruction of political opposition was not hidden. Speer moved through this world as a man who had chosen his angle of vision with enormous care, upward, toward the light columns, toward the marble and the drafting table and the private conversation with the most powerful man in Europe. What lay in the peripheral dark was, he would insist for the rest of his life, simply not something he had been looking at. Whether that was genuine or constructed, whether it was naivety or performance, is the question that every chapter of his life returns to, and that his carefully preserved reputation was built, stone by stone, to deflect. There is a particular kind of madness that arrives dressed as vision. It speaks in blueprints and measurements, in the language of proportion and grandeur, and it is almost impossible to distinguish from genius until the bodies start appearing beneath the rubble. When Hitler spread his maps of Berlin across a table and told Albert Speer what he wanted the capital of the world to look like, Speer did not recoil. He leaned in, he picked up a pencil, and in that gesture, quiet, collegial, almost domestic, the fate of an entire city was decided by two men who had never been elected to anything, operating in the borrowed light of absolute power. The project had a name, Germania, not Berlin refurbished or Berlin expanded, but something altogether new, a capital to be built essentially on top of the existing one, crushing and absorbing and overwriting it with stone and marble and the sheer declaration of permanence. Hitler's ambitions for the city had been accumulating for years before Speer arrived to give them professional shape. The Führer had sketched his own crude architectural fantasies in private notebooks, dreaming of a metropolis that would make Rome look provincial and Paris look like an afterthought. What he needed was someone who could translate fantasy into engineering. Speer, still in his early 30s, still burning with the hunger of a young man desperate to build something that would outlast him, was precisely that man. The two of them bent over the plans together, Hitler's enthusiasm colliding with Speer's technical discipline, and between them, something monstrous and magnificent began to take shape on paper. The centerpiece of the entire scheme was a structure so large it defied ordinary architectural imagination. The Great Hall, the Großhalle, was to stand at the northern end of a grand ceremonial avenue running through the heart of the city. Its dome would have risen to a height of nearly 290 meters, dwarfing the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome by a factor of almost 3. The interior volume was to be so enormous that clouds were expected to form near the ceiling, atmospheric condensation produced by the breath of the 180,000 people who would stand inside it during state ceremonies. This was not architecture in any conventional sense. It was theater on a geological scale, a built environment designed not to shelter human beings, but to diminish them, to make every individual body feel infinitesimal against the mass and reach of the state. Speer understood this function perfectly. He had already achieved something similar with light at Nuremberg. Now he intended to achieve it with stone. The avenue connecting the Great Hall to a triumphal arch in the south was to stretch for nearly 5 kilometers through the city, wider than the Champs-Élysées, longer than almost any comparable boulevard in Europe, lined with ministries, opera houses, hotels, and the headquarters of German industry, all built to a scale that would reduce the pedestrian to a detail in a composition. The triumphal arch at the southern end was to be so large that the Arc de Triomphe in Paris could have been placed inside it, with room to spare. These dimensions were not accidental. They were chosen precisely because they exceeded everything that existed, because the political message of Germania was not civic pride, but dominance, a city that announced, in granite and limestone, that Germany had won and that the winning was eternal. Speer's talent lay in understanding how to make that message architecturally coherent rather than merely bombastic. That, paradoxically, made it more dangerous. To build Germania, you first had to unmake the city that existed. Berlin, in the late 1930s, was a dense, layered metropolis of boulevards and tenements, of working-class districts and bourgeois apartment blocks, of churches and markets, and the accumulated texture of ordinary life lived across generations. Speer's planning authority, a special office established by Hitler's decree and answerable only to Hitler himself, began the work of clearing what stood in the path of the Grand Axis. Buildings were surveyed, assessed, condemned. Entire neighborhoods were earmarked for demolition. The technical machinery of urban clearance, which in ordinary times might have taken decades of legal process and public negotiation, operated here without meaningful constraint. What Speer wanted removed was removed. What he wanted built began to rise. The city was to be remade, and the people inside it were an inconvenience to be managed. The displacement of residents was enormous. Tens of thousands of Berliners were moved from their homes as demolition crews cleared space for the new avenue. and its flanking structures. Among those displaced were Jewish Berliners, families who had already been stripped of their livelihoods, their citizenship, and most of their civil rights under the Nuremberg laws, and who were now losing their housing as well, pushed out of centrally located apartments that Speer's office needed vacated. The machinery of this eviction was not invisible. It was administered through housing offices, documented in correspondence, and coordinated between Speer's planning authority and city agencies that were simultaneously implementing the broader anti-Jewish measures of the Reich. Speer would later claim that he knew nothing of these evictions in any specific sense, that the human consequences of clearance were handled by others and never brought to his attention. It is one of the most carefully maintained positions in his long post-war account of himself, and one of the least credible. The historical record is difficult to reconcile with that claimed ignorance. Speer ran a planning authority of substantial size and ambition. He received reports, he attended meetings, he signed off on decisions about which buildings would fall and which would remain. The specific displacement of Jewish residents from apartments needed for Germania-related rehousing was not a secret operation conducted behind his back. It was part of the administrative fabric of the very project he led with such conspicuous pride. Whether Speer looked directly at those facts and chose not to register them, or whether he registered them and chose later to say he had not, the effect is the same. Thousands of people lost their homes as a direct consequence of decisions made within his domain of authority, and he bore no cost for it. Yet Germania was not merely a project of destruction. It is worth sitting with the genuine scale of what Speer was attempting to design, because the ambition was real, and in its way, extraordinary. The plans encompassed not just the Great Central Axis, but a reorganized transport network, new railway terminals at both ends of the avenue, redesigned residential districts, parks, cultural institutions, and technical infrastructure. Speer visited Rome, studied its imperial architecture, and sought to understand how permanent cities were built, how they endured across centuries rather than decades. He was not simply executing Hitler's fantasies. He was shaping them, refining them, bringing to them a level of professional rigor that Hitler, for all his obsessive interest, could not have supplied alone. The collaboration was genuine, and in that genuineness lies one of its most troubling qualities. This was not a man obeying orders he privately found absurd. This was a man who believed in the work. The relationship between the two of them deepened through the Germania years, in ways that went beyond professional collaboration. Speer has described evenings in which he and Hitler sat alone with the models and the drawings, the rest of the apparatus of dictatorship temporarily absent, two men absorbed in the shared language of architecture. Hitler would become animated in a way he apparently rarely was, in purely political meetings, pointing at the model of the Great Hall, adjusting the proportions of the triumphal arch in his mind, returning again and again to the view that would greet a visitor arriving from the south along the Great Avenue. For Hitler, Germania was the physical proof that he had not merely seized power, but deserved it, that his thwarted application to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts had been history's mistake, corrected at last. For Speer, the arrangement provided something equally fundamental, the patron every young architect dreams of, one with unlimited resources, unlimited authority, and a genuine passion for the work. Neither man seems to have spent much time asking what it cost. By the time the war began to consume the resources and the labor that Germania required, the project had moved from the drawing board into the first stages of physical reality. Demolition had taken place. Test foundations had been sunk into the soft Berlin soil. At Speer's insistence, because he wanted to know whether the ground could bear the weight of structures that had never been attempted before. Early results suggested the soil might not, in fact, support the weight of the Great Hall without extraordinary engineering intervention. This was a problem Speer intended to solve. The war eventually solved it for him differently, by making the whole question moot. But the test pilings were there, driven into the ground of a city whose residents were being displaced to make room for a building that would never exist. What Germania tells us about Speer is something the man spent the rest of his very long life trying to reframe. It tells us that he was willing, not coerced, not reluctant, not a professional pressed into uncomfortable service by political circumstance, but willing, enthusiastic, driven, and capable of sustaining that enthusiasm across years of work on a project whose human costs were visible to anyone who chose to look. The city that would never be built stands now only in the surviving plans and models and test columns buried beneath post-war Berlin, a ghost of granite and ambition. But its traces are real, in the displacement of families, in the cleared ground, in the administrative records of an authority that functioned with quiet, meticulous efficiency under the direction of a man who would later ask the world to believe he had not known what he was doing. The drawings were too precise for that. The signature was on too many pages. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not announce itself as dangerous. It arrives quietly, dressed in blueprints and deadlines, in the satisfaction of a wall rising on schedule and a client who cannot stop smiling. By the mid-1930s, Albert Speer had found the perfect conditions for that ambition to expand without limit. Germany was rearming. Money was flowing into state construction on a scale the Republic had never imagined. And at the center of it all sat a man who shared Speer's obsession with stone and scale, and the impression that great buildings leave on the human psyche. For Speer, the late 1930s were not years of political awakening or ideological commitment. They were years of building and building and building again, faster, larger, more audacious with each commission. The moral weight of what was being built, and by whom, and at what cost to other human beings, appears to have registered somewhere far below the surface of his attention, in a place he had learned, very efficiently, not to visit. The commissions came in waves. Nuremberg first, always Nuremberg, the ceremonial heart of the Reich, the city Hitler had chosen as the stage on which the Nazi movement would perform its grandest self-advertisement. Speer had already transformed the rally grounds with his Cathedral of Light, and now he was asked to make those grounds permanent, to give them the weight of stone rather than the temporary drama of searchlights and canvas. The Zeppelin Field grandstand, modelled loosely on the ancient Pergamon altar, stretched for nearly 400 meters, longer than any structure most visitors had ever stood before. The Congress Hall, intended to seat more than 50,000 delegates, was designed on an even more staggering scale. These were not simply buildings. They were arguments in stone, declarations that the Reich intended to last not for years, but for centuries. And Speer's hand was behind all of it, working through his own planning office, with a staff that grew month by month as the ambitions expanded. Then came the new Reich Chancellery, and with it the commission that would define Speer's professional reputation more than any other in his lifetime. Hitler wanted a new seat of government for the Reich, something that would announce German power to every visiting diplomat and foreign dignitary from the moment they stepped through the door. He wanted it finished in under a year. Most senior architects told him privately that it was not possible. Speer told him it would be done. He assembled a workforce of several thousand men and ran them in shifts around the clock, through winter, through illness, through every ordinary obstacle that construction throws at human beings. The building was completed in roughly 9 months. The gallery alone stretched for nearly 140 meters, twice the length of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, a comparison Hitler himself made with visible satisfaction. When foreign ambassadors walked its length on the way to meet the Führer, that length was the first message they received. Speer understood this completely. He had designed the message himself. The speed of the Chancellery completion transformed Speer's standing within the Reich permanently. He had demonstrated something invaluable to a regime that ran on displays of will overcoming reality. He could actually deliver. Other Nazi grandees promised and revised and promised again. Speer produced. This made him useful in ways that went beyond architecture, and Hitler began drawing him into conversations that had less to do with column proportions and more to do with how a great power ought to project itself to the world. Their relationship in these years had a quality that is difficult to categorize by ordinary political terms. Hitler had no surviving children, no siblings he trusted, no close friendships by any conventional measure. With Speer he was, by multiple accounts, something approaching warm. They would sit together late into the evening at the Reich Chancellery or at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, sketching cities that did not yet exist, arguing about dome proportions and street widths, sharing a kind of creative intimacy that Hitler extended to almost no one else. For Speer, the emotional logic of this relationship was equally powerful and equally revealing. His own father had been a man of considerable professional standing and almost no emotional availability, a man for whom excellence was expected and affection was withheld. Here was a replacement father of almost absurd completeness, one who praised Speer openly, who protected him from bureaucratic enemies, who assigned him work of world historical consequence, and who asked only for loyalty and results in return. Speer would later describe the relationship in his memoirs with a kind of careful distance, as though examining it from outside himself. But the documentary record of his behavior throughout this period tells a different story. He worked for Hitler with a devotion that was not purely professional. It was personal, in ways that would make it much harder to draw clean lines later between what he knew and what he chose not to know. Because behind every limestone block being cut and dressed for the Nuremberg parade grounds, behind every cubic meter of granite destined for Germania's future triumphal avenue, there was a human being doing the cutting. The German earth and stone works, known by its German initials as the Dest, was an SS enterprise established precisely to supply the raw materials Speer's construction program required. It operated quarries adjacent to, or directly within, the expanding network of concentration camps. At Mauthausen, in Austria, prisoners quarried granite from a pit so brutal that the staircase leading down into it, 186 steps, according to survivor testimony, acquired its own grim name among inmates. At Flossenburg, in Bavaria, at Nutzweiler, in Alsace, the pattern repeated. Men worked until they could not, and were then replaced by men who would also work until they could not. Speer knew where the stone came from. This is not an inference drawn from circumstantial evidence. The administrative relationship between his planning office and the Dest was direct. Contracts were discussed, quantities were specified, delivery timelines were negotiated. In correspondence and in meetings, the provenance of the labor was not hidden. It was, within the language of the Reich's bureaucracy, simply the normal state of affairs. Speer would later argue, with considerable persistence, that knowing the institutional source of building materials was different from knowing or approving the conditions under which those materials were extracted. It is an argument that has a certain narrow technical logic. It is also an argument that requires one to believe that a man of Speer's administrative precision and personal intelligence genuinely did not consider what it meant when the SS offered to supply skilled stoneworkers at whatever quantities the Reich architect might require. The construction sites themselves were not sealed environments. Senior figures from Speer's office visited quarries. Inspections were carried out. There are accounts from this period of officials observing working conditions that would have been impossible to misread. Speer himself moved constantly between Berlin, Nuremberg, and the Berghof, inspecting progress and driving his teams harder. The idea that the conditions behind the supply chain were invisible to a man so operationally engaged with every stage of delivery is one that the historical record has found increasingly difficult to sustain. What seems more accurate is that Speer operated with a form of selective attention that was not ignorance, but choice. A decision, perhaps not made in a single conscious moment, but remade continuously across hundreds of small interactions, not to follow the thread of what he knew back to its source. And yet the buildings rose, and they were beautiful in their way, if you could consider only the buildings. The Nuremberg grandstands had a monumental gravity that genuine architectural talent had shaped. The Chancellery Gallery had a proportional intelligence behind it. Speer was not a faker, not a fraud in purely professional terms. He had absorbed enough from Tessenow and had added enough of his own spatial instinct to produce work that would have earned attention in any era. This is part of what makes his story so resistant to simple categorization. The complicity was real. The talent was also real. Both coexisted in the same man, behind the same eyes, carried through the same days. And the talent was used in the service of the complicity, with a wholeness that is hard to look at directly. Through these years, the friendship with Hitler also served a practical function that Speer may or may not have been entirely conscious of. It insulated him. The Nazi hierarchy was a vicious ecosystem of competing power centers, and men of ambition were regularly destroyed by rivals who found the right moment or the right accusation. Göring was powerful and envious of those who drew Hitler's favor. Bormann was quietly lethal, controlling access to the Führer with a bureaucratic ruthlessness that broke careers. Himmler watched everything with the patient attention of a man who expected to be useful at exactly the moment others were not. Speer moved through this environment, protected by the one form of armor that could not be forged or bought: Hitler's genuine personal regard. When enemies tried to undercut him, they found themselves unable to land a clean blow, because the man they were attacking was, in some informal but unmistakable sense, the Führer's companion. This protection freed Speer to build. It also freed him not to look. By the end of the 1930s, the Reichspeer was building for Sev, had expanded beyond Germany's borders, through Austria, through Czechoslovakia, through a Europe that was reorganizing itself under the pressure of German power. And Speer's program expanded with it. New exhibition halls, new administrative buildings, new military facilities, demanded by a state that was simultaneously a construction project and a war machine in preparation. He was 34 years old. He ran a personal empire of draftsmen and surveyors and construction managers. He had the ear of the most powerful man in Europe. He ate dinner with Hitler and drew cities at midnight and watched the stone go up and felt, by every available account, something very close to happiness. The machinery grinding below that happiness was something he had arranged, in the architecture of his own attention, not to see clearly. That arrangement would hold for years, and when it finally began to break down, the story Speer would need to tell about himself would have to be built with the same precision he brought to everything else. Stone by careful stone, shaped until it looked, from a certain distance, almost like the truth. When the first columns of German armor crossed into Soviet territory in the early hours of a June morning in 1941, the men inside those tanks believed they were driving toward a quick, clean victory. Their commanders had promised them it would be over before the autumn leaves fell. The planners in Berlin had drawn up logistics tables on the assumption that the Soviet state would fracture like a rotten beam the moment serious pressure was applied. Hitler himself had declared that all they needed to do was kick in the door. What none of them had adequately prepared for was the sheer, incomprehensible scale of what lay on the other side of that door. The distances, the weather, the roads that turned to mud rivers, and an enemy who, despite staggering losses in the opening weeks, simply refused to stop fighting. By the time the first frosts came, and German soldiers found themselves standing in summer uniforms on the frozen approaches to Moscow, the reality that nobody in the Reich's upper command had dared to speak aloud had begun to announce itself in the language of stalled supply trains and empty ammunition depots. The German war economy had not been built for what was now being asked of it. This is a fact worth pausing on, because it tells you something essential about the confidence, the arrogance with which the Reich had entered the war. In the late 1930s, German industrial production had been impressive, even formidable, but it had been calibrated for short, decisive campaigns, fought with weapons already in the inventory. There had been no serious planning for the kind of sustained, grinding attritional warfare that was now consuming men and machines at a rate the production lines could not match. Factories were still running single shifts in some sectors. Raw material allocation was a bureaucratic labyrinth split between competing agencies that rarely communicated with one another. Military procurement operated through a system of overlapping authorities, so convoluted that even experienced industrialists struggled to navigate it. The economy was, in the bluntest possible terms, still thinking in peacetime, while the war had lurched into something altogether different. At the center of the effort to bring some order to this chaos stood Fritz Todt. He was an engineer by training, a man who had made his name building the Autobahn and the West Wall fortifications along Germany's western border, a figure of genuine practical ability in a regime that preferred spectacle to competence. As Reich Minister of Armaments and Munitions, Todt had been pushing for a fundamental rationalization of the war economy for months, arguing with increasing urgency that unless production was radically reorganized, Germany would lose the capacity to equip its own armies. He was not wrong. He had even prepared a report, delivered to Hitler himself, suggesting that the war in the East could not be won on current terms, a conclusion that did not go down well in the Führerbunker. Todt was a capable man, navigating an impossible system, and he knew it. What he could not have known was how little time he had left. On the 8th of February 1942, Fritz Todt boarded an aircraft at the Rastenburg airfield in East Prussia, not far from Hitler's field headquarters, known as the Wolf's Lair. He had met with Hitler the previous evening. The exact nature of their final conversation has never been fully established. His plane climbed into the winter sky, and then, within minutes of takeoff, it came down. Todt was dead. The cause of the crash has never been conclusively determined, and the rumors that surrounded it, then and for decades afterward, said as much about the paranoid atmosphere of the Nazi inner circle as they did about any established fact. What is not in dispute is that the man who had been carrying the weight of the Reich's armaments crisis on his shoulders was gone, and gone suddenly, and that Germany was fighting on three fronts with an industrial base that was, by any honest measure, beginning to buckle. Hitler needed a replacement, and he needed one immediately. What happened next astonished virtually everyone who witnessed it. The Führer did not turn to one of the senior figures already embedded in the armaments and industrial apparatus, men with years of experience in military procurement, heavy industry, or economic planning. He did not appoint a general, or a party veteran, or an industrial technocrat who had spent his career inside the machinery of German manufacturing. He appointed Albert Speer, who had never managed a factory. Speer, who had never run a procurement system. Speer, whose entire professional existence had been spent drawing buildings, organizing spectacles, and demolishing city blocks to make room for streets that would never be built. The Führer's architect was now the Führer's armaments minister, and the men who had devoted their professional lives to the machinery of German war production were left to absorb what that meant. The disbelief in the corridors of the Reich's industrial and military bureaucracy was profound. Hermann Göring, who ran the 4-year plan and considered the German economy his own personal domain, was furious. Senior figures in the Wehrmacht's armaments offices, who had spent years cultivating relationships and carving out jurisdictional territories, could not understand the logic of the appointment. Party veterans who had been waiting for advancement saw a relative outsider, an aesthetic favorite, a dinner companion, handed one of the most consequential positions in the German state at the worst possible moment in the war. The mockery was not entirely silent. There were men in Berlin who called it the appointment of the court decorator and expected Speer to last weeks before the machinery of the Reich ground him down. What those critics could not see, or perhaps chose not to see, was that Speer brought something to the role that the institutional veterans conspicuously lacked. He had none of their habits. He owed nothing to their established ways of doing things. He had no loyalty to the bureaucratic fiefdoms that had been strangling coordination between agencies for years. And he had something that turned out to be worth a great deal in the Nazi system. He had Hitler's ear, Hitler's trust, and the personal backing of a man whose word ended arguments. This was not a conventional qualification for running a war economy, but in a system where authority derived almost entirely from proximity to one man, it was the only qualification that ultimately mattered. Speer walked into his new ministry carrying no industrial expertise and near absolute political cover, and within days, it became apparent that he intended to use both conditions to their fullest extent. The appointment also tells you something about Hitler that Speer himself understood, perhaps better than any other person in the Reich. Hitler was drawn to men who could transform vision into visible reality, who could take the shapes that existed in his mind and give them physical form. Todt had been competent, reliable, valuable, but he was an engineer's engineer, a man who communicated in load-bearing capacities and material specifications. Speer communicated in buildings that made the Führer weep, the personal chemistry that had ignited in the early 1930s, when an unknown architect had been summoned to help redecorate a borrowed room, had never cooled. This was not a rational appointment. It was a decision made by a man who trusted his feelings above all other evidence. And in this particular case, those feelings pointed at his friend. The scale of what Speer had inherited was staggering, in ways that only became fully apparent as he began to move through the system. German war production in the opening months of 1942 was riddled with inefficiencies so basic that they read less like systemic failures and more like the consequences of nobody ever having forced departments to speak to one another. Standardization was almost non-existent. Factories producing the same weapons were often doing so using different components and different processes, making supply chains fragile and maintenance nightmarish. Military branches had their own procurement offices that competed with one another for materials, meaning that the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force could simultaneously be drawing on the same material reserves for contradictory purposes with no coordinating authority above them. Todt had begun the work of rationalizing some of this, but he had moved carefully, politically, building consensus. Speer had no interest in building consensus. He was going to build something else entirely. Within weeks, Speer had begun pulling together industry committees staffed not by party officials, but by the industrialists who actually ran the factories. Men who understood their own production problems, and who, when given authority and insulation from bureaucratic interference, moved with an efficiency that the old system had made impossible. He called them on the telephone at hours that conventional ministers would have considered inappropriate. He walked factory floors. He pulled data out of the system in ways that nobody had thought to demand before, laying production figures alongside consumption figures and simply reading what the gap between them meant. His working hours were ferocious. The men around him, professionals who had spent decades in their industries, found themselves working alongside an architect in his middle 30s who seemed to be driven by something closer to artistic compulsion than administrative ambition. The rivals who had laughed at the appointment began, slowly, to reassess. The production numbers would take months to move significantly, but even in the first weeks there was a quality to Speer's operation, a directness, a willingness to clear obstacles rather than root around them, that the institutional veterans had not expected. The mockery did not entirely disappear. Powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy do not easily abandon contempt for someone they have already decided to dismiss. But the laughter was becoming quieter, and underneath the quiet there was something else beginning to form, something closer to concern, because it was becoming apparent that the Führer's decorator was not merely warming a seat. He was learning the machinery at a speed that nobody had anticipated, and he was beginning to turn it in ways that served his own accumulating ambitions as much as they served Germany's war. The architect who had spent years designing the monuments of a 1,000-year empire had just been handed the keys to the factory floor, and he intended to build something there too. On the 26th of February 1942, a German military transport plane lifted off from Berlin in grey winter light, carrying Fritz Todt, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. Todt was 55 years old, a brilliant engineer who had built the Autobahn network and the Siegfried Line fortifications, a man whose reputation was nearly as formidable as Speer's. The plane encountered mechanical trouble and crashed near Rastenburg, killing Todt instantly. For the Nazi leadership gathered in their various fiefdoms across the Reich, the death was significant, but not exceptional. The war was grinding through men of all ranks and stations. What mattered was what came next. Hitler, faced with the vacancy of one of the most powerful positions in the wartime state, made a decision that rippled through the Nazi hierarchy like a seismic shock. He appointed Albert Speer to replace Todt. Speer was 36 years old. He had no experience in industrial management, no background in manufacturing, no seat on any armaments committee. What he possessed was the Führer's affection and a reputation for getting things done on time. The reaction among the Nazi establishment was a mixture of disbelief and raw fury. Hermann Göring, who as chief of the 4-year plan theoretically presided over the entire German economy, felt his authority stripped away without ceremony or acknowledgement. Göring had grown soft in recent years, bloated by his own power and addicted to the luxuries of supreme position, and the appointment of the young architect as his effective superior in all matters of armaments production felt like a public humiliation. The military leadership, the generals and admirals whose factories produced the weapons they would use, watched warily. Party officials who had expected one of their own to inherit Todt's position found themselves outmaneuvered by a man they had underestimated because he had seemed merely decorative. Speer understood immediately that his appointment had made him enemies, and that survival in his new position would depend on results so undeniable that criticism would appear both petty and treasonous. Within weeks of taking office, he began his transformation of German war production, a transformation so radical and so effective that it would earn him the title that still clung to his name decades later, the Miracle Minister. The system Speer inherited was fundamentally broken. The German war economy had been structured in the late 1930s on the assumption of short, decisive campaigns, followed by peace, the Blitzkrieg model that had worked against Poland and France. When the invasion of the Soviet Union dragged on through 1941 and into 1942, the economy was caught in a catastrophic mismatch between expectations and reality. Military procurement was fragmented across dozens of competing agencies, each with its own design specifications and manufacturing priorities. The Luftwaffe insisted on aircraft designed to different standards than those the Navy required. The Army fielded tanks with engines and components that could not be quickly replaced or repaired because no standardization existed. Factories produced weapons at a glacial pace, partly because politicians and generals constantly changed their minds about what weapons they actually needed. Bureaucratic obstruction was absolute. A tank factory could not increase output without approval from multiple party offices, each of which moved at the speed of political consensus. Supplies moved through systems clogged with redundancy and contradiction. The economy was, in essence, fighting a two-front war against both the Allies and itself. Speer's revolution began with the principle of radical simplification. He eliminated thousands of different weapon variants and design specifications, forcing the military to accept standardized components that could be mass-produced and rapidly distributed. Where the Army had previously demanded custom tank engines built to exacting individual standards, Speer insisted on a single engine specification, produced by multiple factories, using identical tooling. This meant that any tank could use fuel and ammunition and spare parts meant for any other tank, a transformation that rippled through the entire logistics system and freed up production capacity immediately. Aircraft followed the same logic. Rather than allowing designers to constantly modify specifications, Speer froze designs and demanded that factories focus on volume rather than constant innovation. He stripped away the committee structures that had paralyzed decision-making and replaced them with streamlined chains of command. Ministers could no longer arbitrarily redirect production. That power flowed through Speer's office, which evaluated requests against the overall strategic need. The bureaucratic apparatus that had been designed to assert control now became a tool of control. His second revolutionary move was to transfer authority over production directly to the industrialists themselves. Speer created the Central Planning Board, a body composed of representatives from the major manufacturing firms, rather than party officials or military figures. Siemens sent representatives. Krupp sent representatives. The aircraft manufacturers sent men who understood the actual mechanics of production, rather than the theories of it. These men formed what became known as the committees. Each focused on a different weapons category, and they were given unprecedented authority to make decisions without seeking approval from above. If the tank committee decided that production could be accelerated by using a different alloy in a particular component, they could implement that decision. If they determined that a factory was producing inefficiently, they could reassign production to a more capable facility. The Nazi leadership, watching from their various positions of power, was horrified. Speer was essentially handing over control of war production to capitalists, to the industrialists, whose class the regime had supposedly superseded. But Speer understood something that the ideologues did not. In a total war, the men who actually knew how to make things had to be given the power to make them, or nothing would be made at all. He dressed the system in the language of the regime. The committees were working for the Führer. The rationalizations were serving the National Socialist state. But what he had actually created was a form of military Keynesianism in which industrial capacity determined the constraints of war strategy, not ideology. The results appeared almost immediately. In 1942, German tank production stood at around 340 tanks per month. Within 6 months of Speer's reorganization, that figure had climbed to 680 tanks per month. Aircraft production followed a similar trajectory, climbing from around 1,000 aircraft per month to nearly 2,000 within a year. Ammunition production surged, artillery output increased. The international press, which had access to neutral sources and intelligence reports, began to report on what seemed like an impossible feat. German weapons production was climbing, while the Soviet Union was pounding German industry with bombs, and the Allies were preparing to land in France. The armaments miracle became the phrase used in newspapers from London to New York, a term that mixed grudging respect with strategic alarm. Military planners on both sides of the war began to wonder whether Germany had somehow found a way to win, through industrial capacity after all, whether the material advantage that the Allies believed they possessed might be more illusory than real. What made the miracle possible, beyond Speer's organizational genius, was the vast reserve of forced labor that the Reich had accumulated. As Speer's production demands escalated, so did his requests for workers. Fritz Sauckel, the Reich's labor plenipotentiary, was tasked with finding millions of workers to staff the expanding factories and construction sites. Sauckel rounded up workers from across occupied Europe, from France and Poland and the Soviet Union, from Greece and the Netherlands, from every nation that German armies had conquered. Some were drafted into what was nominally voluntary labor, others were simply conscripted. The conditions were brutal. Workers were fed on starvation rations, housed in camps that were essentially concentration camps in function, if not in official name, and worked until they collapsed. When they collapsed, they were replaced. Speer did not personally conduct this recruitment, and this distinction between demanding workers and recruiting them would become crucial to his later defense. But the connection was absolute and immediate. Speer requested the workers, Sauckel found them, the factories received them, and production climbed. Speer attended meetings where labor conditions were discussed. He toured factories staffed with forced workers. He knew the source of the labor force that was making his miracle possible. The technocrat would later claim a separation between administrative necessity and moral knowledge, between requesting workers and knowing their circumstances, a claim that historians would find increasingly difficult to sustain. Speer's power accumulated with remarkable speed. Within a year of his appointment, he effectively controlled the entire German war economy. Göring, watching from his position as supreme economic authority, was unable to prevent Speer's rise because Hitler clearly favored the younger man. The military, which depended on weapons, had to cooperate with Speer or face production shortfalls. Party officials who challenged him found themselves isolated or outmaneuvered. Speer cultivated allies ruthlessly. He built relationships with generals he needed, attending meetings with Wehrmacht officers and listening carefully to their strategic vision so that he could align production accordingly. He worked alongside industrialists, showing them respect and giving them power in his committees. A remarkable gesture from someone who served a regime that had nominally subordinated capitalism to state control. He developed a small personal staff that was intensely loyal to him, men like Rolf Stellrecht and Hans Kammler, who understood his vision and executed his orders without question. He worked 18-hour days and was visible constantly in factories and offices, in contrast to Göring's increasingly distant and indulgent lifestyle. The contrast itself became part of Speer's growing power. He was the man who got things done. He was the man the Führer trusted. He was the man whose decisions mattered. By 1943, as the war turned decisively against Germany at Stalingrad and in North Africa, Speer's armaments miracle appeared to be the only advantage the Reich possessed. He was regularly summoned to Hitler's private chambers, brought into the Führer's evening briefings, consulted on matters that went far beyond weapons production. The intimacy deepened the relationship that had always been rooted in aesthetic appreciation and emotional need. Hitler had always wanted to be an artist, and in Speer, he saw someone who understood beauty in creation. Speer had always wanted approval and power, and in Hitler, he found a patron whose ambitions were limitless. But Speer was also becoming something else. He was becoming indispensable. A regime built on loyalty and hierarchy was increasingly dependent on the decisions of one man, on his judgment and his will. This created both extraordinary power and extraordinary vulnerability. Power, because as long as Hitler lived and valued him, no one could challenge him. Vulnerability, because if that favor ever wavered, if Hitler's attention ever turned elsewhere, Speer's position would collapse instantly. The miracle itself would not be enough to save him, because in the Nazi system, survival depended not on achievement, but on proximity to the center of power. What Speer had accomplished in production terms was genuine. The statistics were real. Weapons that would have been impossible to manufacture under the old system were now rolling out of factories in unprecedented quantities. This was not propaganda or accounting manipulation. German tank and aircraft production in 1943 and into 1944 was higher than it had been in the peacetime economy, and this remained true even as Allied bombing began to systematically destroy German cities and factories. Historians would later debate whether Speer's brilliance extended this war by months or even years, whether the armaments miracle allowed Germany to fight on when otherwise it might have collapsed, whether Speer's efficiency ultimately cost thousands of additional lives that would have been spared by a quicker defeat. The question is unanswerable but not meaningless. What is certain is that Speer's rise marked a shift in the Nazi regime toward pure power, divorced from ideology, toward the triumph of the technocrat over the true believer. And what is equally certain is that this triumph, this accumulation of personal authority that rivaled even the most powerful figures in the Third Reich, came at a cost. The enemies Speer had made through his rise were merely waiting for a moment of vulnerability, waiting for the miracle to finally fail. And in 1943, that moment was beginning to approach. Behind every production statistic, Speer reported to Hitler, every tank rolled off the line, every artillery shell counted into warehouses, there was a body, not a metaphor, a human body, transported against its will, assigned a number, and put to work under conditions that had nothing to do with a wage or a choice. The armaments miracle that made Speer the most admired minister in the Reich did not spring from German industrial ingenuity alone. It was built, in enormous part, on a machinery of coerced human labor, so vast that it required its own administrative apparatus, its own chain of command, and its own very deliberate set of decisions made by men in suits, sitting around tables in heated offices. Speer was one of those men. He attended those tables. He signed the correspondence that fed the machine. Fritz Sauckel was not a figure of refinement, a former sailor and factory worker who had joined the Nazi movement in its earliest years. He rose to become Gauleiter of Thuringia before being appointed by Hitler in the spring of 1942 as plenipotentiary general for labor, a title that meant, in practice, that he was responsible for finding the workers that Speer's expanding armaments empire required. Sauckel would later stand in the same dock at Nuremberg as Speer and would be sentenced to death, hanged for crimes against humanity. He was, by any measure, a brutal instrument. But an instrument requires a hand to direct it, and the hand that directed Sarkel, consistently and in writing, belonged in significant part to the Minister of Armaments. Their relationship was not incidental, it was structural. Speer needed workers, Sarkel obtained them. The arrangement was not kept secret, it was bureaucratized. By the summer of 1942, Germany had already absorbed hundreds of thousands of foreign workers into its war economy. But Speer's rationalization program was accelerating production targets faster than the existing labor pool could sustain them. He needed more hands in the aircraft factories, more bodies in the steel plants, more workers in the underground facilities being excavated in the Reich's interior. He communicated these needs to Sarkel in formal requests that survive in the historical record, documents bearing his signature, and the language of administrative demand. The workers Sarkel delivered came predominantly from occupied Eastern Europe, from the Soviet Union, from Poland, from Ukraine, territories where the Nazi occupation treated the civilian population not as people deserving of rights, but as a resource to be extracted. Recruitment in the Eastern Territories frequently meant men with guns arriving in villages and loading people onto trains. The conditions under which these workers lived and labored varied across the Reich's industrial geography, but the floor was very low. Eastern workers, classified under racial hierarchies that determined their food rations, their housing, their freedom of movement, and their ability to seek medical treatment, occupied the bottom of that hierarchy. They wore identifying badges. They were housed in guarded camps adjacent to the factories where they worked. They were fed less than their German or Western European counterparts. In some cases, considerably less. Mortality rates among Soviet and Polish workers were significantly higher than those among workers from Western Europe, a disparity that reflected deliberate policy rather than circumstance. Speer's own factory inspection visits, documented across multiple accounts, took him into facilities where the presence and condition of these workers was impossible to overlook. The concentration camp dimension of the labor system adds a further layer that Speer's post-war narrative struggled to accommodate. The SS ran its own labor allocation program, hiring out concentration camp prisoners to industrial enterprises at a fee paid directly to the SS. Armaments factories, under Speer's ministerial authority, used this labor. Correspondence exists in which Speer's ministry negotiated directly with SS administrators over prisoner allocations. Speer later argued that these negotiations were handled by subordinates, that he was unaware of their full content, and that the distinction between his ministry requesting workers and his ministry managing the camps was a meaningful one. Historians examining the archival record have found these arguments increasingly difficult to sustain. The requests went out under his authority. The workers arrived. The camps that supplied them operated with the knowledge and participation of the ministry he ran. There were meetings. This point is not a speculation or an inference. It is a matter of documented record. Speer attended conferences at which the sourcing and condition of foreign labor were discussed in terms that left no room for misunderstanding about the nature of the system. Officials around these tables used language that described the conscription of workers from occupied territories plainly, without euphemism, because among themselves there was no need for euphemism. Speer sat at these tables as the minister whose production requirements were the reason the meetings were being held. His later claim that he heard these discussions without registering their implications, that the machinery of the labor system existed somehow at the periphery of his awareness, while he focused on output, required his listeners to accept a portrait of selective inattention that those who worked alongside him found difficult to reconcile with his reputation for forensic administrative intelligence. One of the most consequential of these documented exchanges involved Speer's direct appeals to Hitler when Sarkel's deliveries fell short of what the armaments program required. On at least several occasions, Speer went above Sarkel to the Führer himself, arguing that production targets could not be met without additional labor mobilization. These appeals were not abstract complaints about workforce numbers. They were specific requests, rooted in specific shortfalls, and they had specific consequences. Renewed sweeps through occupied territories, further conscriptions, further transports. The chain of cause and effect was not hidden. Speer understood how industrial logistics worked better than almost anyone in the Reich. He understood that a request for 50,000 additional workers meant 50,000 people being removed from their homes and placed in conditions he had observed with his own eyes. There is a version of Speer that his defenders, and for many years he had genuine defenders, including serious historians, constructed from these facts. A man so consumed by the problem of production that the human dimension of the system registered only abstractly. A technocrat whose capacity for moral attention had been crowded out by the demands of industrial management at wartime scale. This version has a certain psychological plausibility. Institutions do produce this kind of narrowing. Bureaucracies do enable ordinary people to participate in terrible systems without confronting their full character. But the narrowing argument depends on a degree of genuine ignorance, and the evidence in Speer's case points not toward ignorance, but toward something more uncomfortable: awareness managed, compartmentalized, and set aside in the service of ambition and output. The French and Dutch workers present a different dimension of the same problem. Workers conscripted from Western-occupied territories arrived under different formal categories than Eastern laborers, technically designated as workers under compulsion rather than racial subordinates. But the practical realities of their situation were frequently grim. Many had been promised wages and conditions that did not materialize. Many could not leave. Many worked alongside the Eastern workers and concentration camp prisoners whose conditions were visibly worse. A proximity that did not require sophisticated analysis to understand. Speer's ministry set the production targets. His ministry determined where workers were deployed. The ministerial apparatus he ran was not a passive recipient of a labor system created by others. It was an active and continuous driver of demand within that system. Sarkel and Speer would clash repeatedly in the later war years, as Speer attempted to retain skilled foreign workers in their existing factory positions, rather than having Sarkel rotate them out and replace them with new conscripts. Speer framed this dispute as a matter of industrial efficiency. Skilled workers produced more than unskilled ones, and constant rotation was wasteful. He was correct about the economics, but the dispute also produced a paper trail that cut directly against his post-war claim of limited involvement. To argue about the deployment of foreign workers, to fight for their retention in specific facilities, to send communications asserting his ministry's priority claim over their labor. All of this required knowing who they were, how they had been obtained, and under what conditions they were being held. Efficiency and complicity, in this case, wore the same face. By 1943, the scale of the foreign labor program had reached a magnitude that touched virtually every significant industrial enterprise in the Reich. Millions of men and women from across occupied Europe were working in German factories, farms, mines, and construction sites. The infrastructure of their captivity, the camps, the ration systems, the guard apparatus, was woven into the fabric of the German wartime economy in ways that any senior minister who wished to see it could not have missed. Speer had visited factories. He had walked production floors. He had spoken with plant managers who depended on this labor. His own diaries, reconstructed in Spandau, are largely silent on what he saw on those visits, a silence that historians would later examine as one of the most revealing features of a document composed with extraordinary care. What a meticulous man chooses not to record is itself a kind of record. The central tension of what came later, the defense Speer offered at Nuremberg, the narrative he wrote in his cell and published to the world, rested on a distinction between demanding the output of a system and running the system itself. It was a distinction with a certain legal utility, and it may even have saved his life, but it was a distinction that required severing cause from effect, in a way that the documentary records struggled to support. The armaments miracle was real. The production numbers climbed. Germany's war machine ran longer and harder than it might otherwise have done. And behind each of those figures, behind the standardized parts and the rationalized procurement chains and the efficiency committees that Speer built with such visible brilliance, there were human beings transported by force and worked without freedom. Speer asked for them. They were provided. He built his miracle on their labor, and then spent the rest of his life arguing that he had not truly known what he was building on. By the spring of 1943, Albert Speer had been the Reich Minister of Armaments for just over a year, and the miracle he had orchestrated was already running headlong into the machinery of reality. His production figures climbed with almost mechanical precision, tanks rolling off the assembly lines in greater numbers than the Germans had managed the year before, aircraft emerging from reorganized factories, ammunition stockpiles growing week by week. To anyone reading the statistics in a Berlin office, it would have seemed as though German industry was reaching new heights, even as the military situation deteriorated. But Speer, more than most men in the Reich leadership, understood the fundamental truth that no manufacturing miracle could overcome the collapse of strategy and the drain of resources that total war imposed. The numbers he generated were real, yet they answered a question that was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Could German industry produce enough weapons to win a war that was already being lost? The disaster at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943 had shattered the myth of German invincibility in ways that rippled through every level of the regime. The Soviet counteroffensive had annihilated the Sixth Army, and the loss of nearly 300,000 men in a single campaign represented not just a military catastrophe, but a rupture in the psychological fabric that held the Nazi state together. Speer felt it as keenly as anyone, though his response was characteristically rational. The destruction of German forces in the East meant that the war could no longer be won through military superiority. It could only be prolonged, and only if the home front continued to supply the fighting forces with an unending stream of equipment. This was the cold calculation that drove him through 1943, to keep the apparatus functioning, to squeeze more production from each factory, to rationalize further, to eliminate waste, because the alternative was not negotiation, but total collapse. Yet even as he worked with this clarity, the confidence that had sustained him through his first year as minister began to fray at the edges. The collapse of German positions in North Africa accelerated the psychological shift. In the spring of 1943, the last German and Italian forces retreated from Tunisia, and with them went the dream of German strategic expansion southward. North Africa had never been Hitler's primary concern. The true vision of conquest lay in the east, but its loss marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of the war. Germany retreating on every front, forced to fight with no possibility of achieving territorial objectives, focused entirely on survival. For Speer, the loss of North Africa meant something more immediate. It meant that American and British air power, which had been gradually intensifying its attacks on German industrial targets, could now operate from bases far closer to the Reich itself. The bomber streams would grow larger, more numerous, and increasingly capable of striking at the very factories whose output Speer had reorganized and rationalized. The man who had built his reputation on controlling the machinery of production now faced an opponent that could destroy that machinery faster than he could replace it. The bombing campaign that intensified through the summer and autumn of 1943 was unlike anything the Germans had anticipated. The RAF had long carried out night raids against German cities, but the arrival of American daylight bombing, formations of hundreds of four-engined bombers striking in broad daylight with fighter escort, represented a quantum leap in destructive capacity. The attacks on industrial targets, such as the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and the synthetic fuel plants, became legendary for their precision and their devastating effect. Speer watched in horror as factories he had worked to improve were reduced to rubble, as production schedules he had carefully coordinated became impossible to maintain. Yet, his response was not to resign or to admit defeat. It was to adapt. He instituted dispersal programs, moving production underground into specially constructed bunkers, decentralizing manufacturing to prevent any single bombing raid from crippling an entire industry. The scale of this reorganization was colossal, yet it was fundamentally an attempt to manage decline rather than reverse it. Speer was rearranging the furniture on a sinking ship, and with each passing month it became clearer that no amount of administrative brilliance could overcome the physics of the situation. Sometime in the early autumn of 1943, Speer fell seriously ill. The exact nature of his condition remains somewhat mysterious. He himself offered vague accounts of circulatory problems and exhaustion. Contemporary observers suggested various diagnoses, and modern historians have speculated about whether the illness was partly psychosomatic, a manifestation of the stress and cognitive dissonance he carried beneath his facade of competent control. What is certain is that the illness was severe enough to remove him from active duty for months, hospitalizing him and forcing him to cede day-to-day authority to subordinates and rivals. In the history of the Third Reich, timing mattered enormously, and Speer's removal from power at this precise moment, when the war was turning irreversibly against Germany and every major power faction was beginning to reposition itself for the post-war reckoning that some of them could now foresee, was catastrophic to his long-term interests. While Speer lay in a hospital bed, Martin Bormann, the unseen power behind Hitler's throne, began consolidating his influence over the Führer. Heinrich Himmler, commanding vast SS resources and increasingly independent in his power base, began moving against the Armaments Ministry's authority. Even Göring, whose air force was failing to defend German skies against the bomber offensive, saw an opportunity to reclaim some of the influence he had lost to the younger, more dynamic Speer. Bormann was the particular threat. He had watched Speer's rise with the cold calculation of a man who understood that power in the Nazi state was a zero-sum game in which trust and access to the Führer were the most valuable currencies. Hitler's private affection for Speer, the intimate dinners, the architectural discussions, the sense that he had found an heir to share his dreams, had been a shield against rivals and a source of protection. But affection could evaporate quickly in the Nazi hierarchy, and Bormann had spent years perfecting the art of isolating powerful men by controlling the flow of information to Hitler and managing his daily schedule. With Speer absent and visibly weakened by illness, Bormann moved to place his own people in key positions within the Armaments Ministry. He worked to emphasize Speer's failures, the production figures, impressive on paper, that still could not match the pace of German losses, the bombing campaign that Speer's vaunted organizational reforms had failed to prevent. He whispered to Hitler that the Minister of Armaments had grown too powerful, too independent, that he needed to be brought back under party control. The assault was subtle but relentless, the sort of political operation that thrived in the paranoid atmosphere of the Nazi court. When Speer finally returned to his duties in late 1943, he found his position subtly diminished. He was still minister, still officially responsible for armaments production, but the informal power he had accumulated, the direct access to Hitler, the independence to make decisions without party interference, had been partially eroded. More significantly, he began to understand something that his previous success had obscured. The war was being lost, and no administrative measure could reverse that fact. This realization struck him with particular force, because it struck at the very foundation of his identity. Speer had always understood himself as a problem solver, a man who imposed order on chaos through superior organization and clearer thinking. But the problem he now faced, a two-front war against industrial powers, vastly superior in raw resources, was not a problem that rationalization could solve. It was a condition that could only be managed, and only temporarily. The gap between the scope of his ambitions and the limits of his actual power, which had been invisible to him during the period of his ascendancy, now became painfully apparent. In his private conversations, and in the carefully edited diaries he would later begin smuggling out of imprisonment, Speer started to acknowledge, very cautiously, a distance between himself and Hitler that had not existed in their relationship before. The Führer had aged visibly through 1943. His hands trembled more noticeably. His voice grew hoarse from extended ranting sessions. The conferences that had once been forums for strategic discussion had devolved into opportunities for Hitler to rehearse his resentments and fantasies. Speer had always been willing to suspend disbelief in the presence of the man he had idolized, but the accumulation of lost battles and failed predictions was beginning to make that suspension of disbelief more difficult to maintain. Hitler's explanations for German military failures, the treachery of generals, the incompetence of subordinates, the inevitable German victory postponed rather than prevented, were increasingly unconvincing to a mind as analytically precise as Speer's. Yet he could not afford to voice these doubts openly. To question Hitler's judgment openly in 1943 was to invite catastrophe. Instead, Speer began to cultivate a kind of emotional and intellectual distance, a separation between his public loyalty and his private assessments of reality. This distancing manifested itself in subtle ways. Speer began to spend more time with generals and industrialists than with the Nazi leadership, finding in their company a kind of realism that was increasingly absent from Hitler's entourage. He started to position himself as the administrator, trying to manage decline rather than as the visionary, collaborating in grandiose dreams. When opportunities arose to deflect blame for production failures, he took them, quietly directing attention toward the failings of other ministries, or toward the incomprehensible scale of the bomber offensive. He was beginning, though he could not have articulated it this way, to construct a narrative of himself as a man trapped in an impossible situation, doing his best to manage catastrophe, rather than as a willing architect of the regime's ambitions. This narrative would eventually become the foundation of his post-war defense. But in 1943, it was still inchoate, more a pattern of behaviors and unspoken assumptions than a fully formed argument. The visible decline of the Reich's strategic position throughout the latter half of 1943 made this psychological repositioning possible and even necessary. The invasion of Sicily by Allied forces in July represented a shock to the Nazi system, second only to Stalingrad. For the first time, Enemy armies were fighting on what the Germans considered to be European soil, only one sea crossing away from the Italian mainland. Mussolini fell from power shortly afterward, and Italy's subsequent armistice negotiations, though kept secret from the German public, were widely understood within the Nazi leadership to represent a fundamental break in the Axis alliance. The Germans found themselves occupying Italian territory and fighting off both the Allies and former Italian forces, extending their military commitments at precisely the moment when their resources were most strained. For Speer, Italy's defection was a symbol of the unraveling of the entire Nazi strategy. He could produce more tanks and more aircraft, but he could not produce allies, and he could not produce the strategic genius required to maneuver out of a war that was turning against Germany on every front. The Allies, meanwhile, had begun bombing German cities on a scale that touched even the civilian population directly. Hamburg, struck by a massive firestorm in late July 1943, suffered perhaps 40,000 deaths in a single night of bombing. The city's center was essentially erased, and the psychological impact on both the German public and the leadership was profound. Speer, visiting the ruins, understood viscerally what the air war meant. Not just the destruction of industrial targets, but the demonstration of German powerlessness over its own territory. Goering had promised that no enemy bomb would fall on German soil, and that promise had become a contemptible mockery. Speer's own production achievements, no matter how impressive the numbers, could not defend against this onslaught. For the first time, serious voices within the Nazi leadership began, very quietly, to discuss the possibility that the war might not be won, that it might instead be lost catastrophically. These conversations happened only among trusted circles, often in the half-light of evening, after too much wine. But they happened. The consensus that had held the regime together through the triumphant early years, that victory was inevitable, that the Führer's genius would ultimately prevail, began to fracture. Speer navigated this fracture with increasing skill, never quite abandoning his loyalty to Hitler, but creating more and more psychological space between the reality he observed and the vision Hitler continued to articulate. The cracks that appeared in 1943 were not just cracks in the Nazi state's military position. They were cracks in Speer's own certainty, in the emotional and intellectual framework that had sustained his participation in the regime. He had arrived at the Ministry of Armaments at the apex of German military fortune, riding on a wave of victories that seemed to validate every Nazi claim about German superiority and German destiny. Now, as the war turned against Germany, as the certainties crumbled, Speer faced a choice that he could not articulate even to himself: to continue down the path of complicity and commitment, or to begin constructing an alternative narrative that might allow him to survive what was increasingly becoming a post-war world. The illness that struck him in autumn of 1943, whether physical or psychological in origin, marked a turning point in which the invincible architect of the Third Reich began, almost imperceptibly, to become the man who would survive the Third Reich, the man who would tell the story of the Third Reich, the man who would remake himself in the image of decency and reason that the post-war world would demand. The genius administrator narrative was beginning to fray, not because his administration was failing, it was actually succeeding in extraordinary ways, but because administration itself, no matter how brilliant, could not prevail against the gathering storm of defeat. By 1943, the narrative had begun to shift in the mind of Albert Speer, the man who had arrived at the Armaments Ministry as a triumphant problem solver, celebrated internationally for his production miracles, now found himself navigating a landscape fundamentally altered by the grinding reality of a war no longer winnable. Stalingrad had fallen in February, its streets turned to ash, and its defenders dead or captured in numbers that shattered the myth of German invincibility. North Africa had collapsed. The Mediterranean was lost. And in the skies above Germany itself, the scale of Allied bombing was reaching a crescendo that no amount of rationalized production could match. Speer watched the aerial photographs with the eye of an architect observing the systematic destruction of his life's work. Factories he had rebuilt after bombing raids were targeted and destroyed again. Cities where he had orchestrated grand ceremonial spaces were reduced to rubble. The production figures that had seemed miraculous just months earlier now appeared as mere statistics in a losing ledger. It was during this period, as the war turned against Germany, that Speer fell seriously ill. The illness was mysterious. Fevers, exhaustion, a condition that resisted diagnosis and kept him hospitalized for weeks in a state of near incapacity. Whether the illness was genuinely physical or partly psychosomatic remains unclear in the historical record, but the timing was significant. While Speer lay in a sickbed, his enemies moved. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and the architect's longtime rival, worked to consolidate power in his absence. Heinrich Himmler, whose SS operated in near-total independence from Speer's armaments apparatus, began positioning himself for the post-war world that many senior Nazis now privately believed was inevitable. Speer's illness removed him from the daily proximity to Hitler that had been the source of his influence, and when he returned to his duties, the center of power had subtly shifted. It was perhaps in this moment of diminished authority that Speer began to think seriously about the future. Not the victory that Hitler still publicly proclaimed, but the reckoning that all but the most deluded could see approaching. The narrative shift began carefully, almost imperceptibly. Speer did not abandon his position or publicly doubt Hitler, but he began to construct a parallel story, a history of principled resistance that he could point to when the Allies came, as come they would. The first of these claims concerned the Berlin armaments workers. Speer would later assert that he had opposed the deportation of Jewish workers from Berlin's factories, that he had fought against the removal of these skilled laborers who were vital to production. He would claim that he had told Hitler directly that the armaments industry needed these workers, that their removal would undermine the war effort. The documentary record offers partial support for this claim. There are minutes from a meeting in which Speer did argue for the retention of skilled workers in essential industries. But here lies the critical ambiguity. Speer opposed their deportation not because they were human beings whose lives had value beyond utility, but because their absence damaged production figures. He was defending the workers as tools, not as people. And more troublingly, while Speer may have resisted the total clearance of Berlin's Jewish workforce, he was simultaneously requesting ever-increasing numbers of forced laborers from Fritz Sauckel to supply his factories across the Reich. The rescue, he claimed, was selective and self-interested rather than principled. The second claim was more dramatic. Speer would later tell interrogators, and eventually his biographers, that he had contemplated assassinating Hitler. Specifically, he claimed to have considered introducing poison gas into the ventilation system of the Führerbunker in the final weeks of the war. The details of this alleged plot varied slightly between retellings, but the essential narrative remained. Speer, disgusted by the Nero decree and by Hitler's intention to drag Germany into total destruction, had actually planned to kill his mentor and patron. He claimed to have studied the Führerbunker's infrastructure, to have identified the ventilation shafts, to have acquired or considered acquiring the necessary poison. It was a story of last-moment resistance, of moral awakening, of the man who had built monuments to tyranny, finally turning against it. The problem with this narrative is that no contemporary evidence supports it. There are no documents recording Speer's involvement in any assassination plot. There are no letters, no conversations recorded by those around him, no memorials written during the war itself. The claim appears only in Speer's post-war testimonies and writings, emerging from memory after the war was already lost. When pressed by historians to name who had supplied him with information about the ventilation system, or who had agreed to help him, Speer's account became vague, shifting, unreliable, less like a man recalling a genuine conspiracy, and more like one embellishing a story with each telling. What Speer did do in the final year of the war was begin to cultivate relationships that might prove useful when peace came. He opened channels to foreign industrialists and military figures, particularly Swedish industrialists, and through them, to individuals with connections to the Allies. He carefully cultivated a persona as the rational technocrat, the man who understood that the war was lost, who had opposed the most extreme brutalities of the regime, who could be trusted to work with the victors because he had never truly believed in Nazi ideology. Some of these foreign contacts were genuine relationships built over years of industrial cooperation. Others were carefully constructed in the final months, connections established with an eye toward post-war survival. Speer spoke to these contacts in tones of regret and distance, suggesting that he was as much a prisoner of circumstances as Germany itself was a prisoner of Hitler's madness. He was, in essence, beginning to audition for absolution. Speer's management of his own paper trail was equally calculated. He began to carefully curate which documents he kept and which he allowed to disappear. He dictated memoranda in such language as to preserve a record of his warnings about the war's direction, while simultaneously obscuring his direct orders for increased forced labor. His files were kept in a manner that would be convenient to review post-war, organized, and indexed in a way that suggested a man of methodical habits rather than a man with something to hide. There is a famous photograph from this period, Speer in uniform, standing before a map of the Third Reich, his expression one of controlled gravity. It is the image of a man aware that he is being watched by history, preparing his performance for posterity. Some of the decisions he made in these final months were undoubtedly motivated by genuine opposition to Hitler's Nero decree. His directive to military commanders on the Western Front that they should preserve German infrastructure rather than destroy it was an act of direct insubordination that took real courage to execute. But it was also a perfectly timed act of resistance, visible, documented, easily pointed to as evidence of moral awakening, precisely when such evidence would be most valuable. The irony that Speer's post-war defense rested on is profound. He had spent 12 years building monuments to Hitler's vision, creating aesthetic and physical structures that embodied Nazi power and permanence. He had designed the spaces where the regime's rituals were performed, orchestrated the visual language through which its authority was expressed. When it became clear that these structures would be destroyed by bombing, by defeat, by time, Speer's narrative became one of salvation rather than creation. He positioned himself as the man who had tried to preserve what could be preserved, who had seen the madness and attempted to contain it. The architect who had demolished neighborhoods to make way for Germania now presented himself as someone opposed to destruction. The man who had asked Sokol for millions of workers now claimed to have fought to protect the smallest group among them. The technocrat who had said he was apolitical and merely solving problems now claimed to have recognized the regime's fundamental evil. The trap that Speer walked into, the trap he almost certainly recognized even as he set it, was that his narrative of resistance required a matching narrative of ignorance. If he had truly opposed the regime's crimes, how could he have not known about its worst atrocities? The Holocaust could not be excluded from the story because its scale was too enormous. its visibility too widespread among the German leadership. So Speer's emerging narrative had to accommodate a special kind of blindness, a willful refusal to see what was plainly visible to anyone at his level of authority. He had attended meetings where the deportations were discussed. He had visited factories where concentration camp prisoners worked. He had signed orders affecting millions of people. But he had, in his own retelling, managed to remain somehow separate from these things, focused on production figures, while humanity was being systematized out of existence. It was the alibi of the technocrat, the claim that one's responsibility ended at the boundary of one's specific function, that one could be brilliant within a narrow sphere, while remaining innocent of the larger catastrophe that sphere supported. By 1944, as the Red Army advanced from the east, and the Americans and British from the west, Speer had crafted the essential elements of what would become his post-war defense. He had begun to position himself as a man who had tried to mitigate the regime's worst impulses, who had opposed certain orders, who had contemplated assassination, who was fundamentally at odds with the ideology he had served. He had cultivated foreign relationships and established lines of communication that might preserve his life when Germany fell. He had carefully organized his documents to present himself in the most favorable light. He had, in short, begun the process of becoming not Albert Speer, the architect of Nazi power, but Albert Speer, the educated man who had fallen under a dictator's spell and who had tried, in small ways, to resist that spell's effects. The tragedy of his post-war story, or perhaps its dark comedy, is that he would prove to be remarkably successful at this rebranding. He would survive when more ideologically committed Nazis swung from ropes. He would sell millions of books. He would become famous as the face of remorse, when the reality was that he was perfecting the art of self-exoneration. The narrative he constructed in these final months of the war was not a confession but a performance, so carefully choreographed that it would take historians decades to deconstruct it, to separate the genuine acts of resistance from the invented ones, to understand that what had seemed like a man finally opposing evil was often a man simply positioning himself for survival. The question that emerges from this period is deceptively simple, but profoundly unsettling. At what point does performing resistance become indistinguishable from genuine resistance? If Speer's acts in 1945, ordering commanders to preserve infrastructure, refusing to implement the Nero decree in certain areas, were genuinely motivated by a growing moral clarity, do they not count as resistance, even if they were also useful for his post-war narrative? Or is the very fact that they aligned so perfectly with his self-interest and his survival strategy enough to render them suspect? The documentary record cannot definitively answer this question. What it can show is that Speer began the process of reinvention before the war ended, that he was aware enough of coming defeat to position himself for a post-war world, and that the narrative he was constructing bore careful relation to what he believed would be believed rather than to what could be verified. The man who had written architectural treatises with precision, who had designed with mathematical exactness, was now designing something far more subtle, a version of himself that could walk out of the rubble of Germany and into the sympathy of the world. The spring of 1945 arrived in Germany with a terrible clarity. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River, closing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces had punched through the Rhine and were sweeping into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. For the first time since his ascent to power, Adolf Hitler faced not merely the possibility of defeat, but its certainty. The apparatus that had sustained his vision for more than a decade was collapsing into rubble, and in this final extremity, he issued an order that would reveal, in its starkest form, the distance between his megalomaniacal ambitions and the man who had built them into material reality. On the 19th of March, 1945, Hitler dictated Directive Number 30, known to history as the Nero Decree. The Führer had taken his title from the Roman emperor, who, according to legend, watched Rome burn from a golden palace. But Hitler's ambition ran in a different direction. If the Reich could not survive, then nothing should survive. In language that carried the weight of a tyrant's final testament, Hitler ordered the systematic destruction of all German industrial infrastructure, factories, steelworks, power plants. He demanded the demolition of railway networks, canal systems, and bridges. He called for the poisoning of water supplies and the destruction of food stores. The decree extended even to the autobahns that Speer had built as monuments to German engineering. Everything that could sustain life or commerce or resistance was to be obliterated. Germany itself would be rendered a wasteland so complete that the Allies would inherit nothing but smoking earth and rubble. The order was read aloud to Armaments Minister Albert Speer in the Führerbunker, where he had come for one of his increasingly tense meetings with the dictator, who had been his patron for more than a decade. Speer listened in silence. What he heard was not merely a military instruction, but a death sentence, not only for Germany, but for millions of ordinary Germans who would starve or freeze once the nation's infrastructure had been reduced to ash. The Nero Decree was an order to commit national suicide on a scale scarcely imaginable, and it emanated from a man who was now spending entire days in the bunker, rarely emerging to the surface, communicating through intermediaries who did not dare contradict him. Here, in this moment, we encounter one of the central pivots of the Speer legend, his defiance of Hitler's final madness. It is a story that Speer himself would tell repeatedly in the decades to come, a story of the technocrat who finally said no. But the historical record is more complicated than the legend. Speer did not refuse the order outright. Instead, he engaged in something more subtle and more politically astute. He did not challenge Hitler to his face. Rather, he seized upon an ambiguity in the directive. It assigned the implementation of the Nero Decree to military commanders in the field, not to the Armaments Ministry. Speer immediately obtained a second copy of the decree and departed the bunker with a purpose that was both practical and strategic. Over the subsequent weeks, as the collapsing German front compressed into chaos, Speer embarked on a last tour of the Western Front. He traveled to meet the Wehrmacht commanders, whose armies were retreating in disarray before the advancing Americans and British. To each one, Speer carried the Nero Decree, and to each one, he delivered the same carefully calibrated message. The order was insane. The Führer was no longer in control of his faculties, and the commanders should preserve the infrastructure in their territories. What made this performance brilliant, from a purely political standpoint, was that Speer did not tell the commanders to ignore Hitler directly. He presented it rather as a matter of practical military necessity. The infrastructure of the Rhineland and the Ruhr, Speer argued, might be needed for Germany's final defense. To destroy it would be to weaken Germany's capacity to resist, and to deny Germany any prospect of negotiated survival. By reframing the order as tactically counterproductive rather than morally abhorrent, Speer provided the commanders with a rationale that did not require them to openly mutiny against the Führer. And one by one, across the final weeks of the war, commanders who had spent years unquestioningly obeying Hitler's most extreme orders suddenly found reasons to delay or circumvent the implementation of the Nero Decree. The bridges over the Rhine, in many places, were not destroyed. The factories remained standing. The railroads kept their tracks. It is important here to acknowledge what was genuine in this defiance. Speer was, in these final weeks, placing himself in genuine danger. Had Hitler discovered that Speer was actively working to subvert the Nero decree, the consequences would have been swift and terminal. The Führer had long since moved past any sentiment of personal attachment when it came to those who thwarted his will. Bormann and Himmler were still circling, seeking any opportunity to eliminate Speer as a rival and claim his power for themselves. Speer was acting, on one level, from a conviction that the Nero decree would inflict irreparable damage on the German people, and that conviction, whatever else might be said of it, required courage. But the historical record also reveals that Speer's actions were perfectly timed. They came only when German defeat was absolute and irreversible. They came only when it was clear that Hitler himself would never hold power again to punish such insubordination. There is another layer to this moment that historians have long examined with a kind of uncomfortable scrutiny. Speer was not merely opposing the Nero decree because it was destructive. He was also, in these final weeks, thinking ahead to what would come after defeat. He was a man of exceptional intelligence, and he understood that when the war ended, those who had resisted Hitler's worst orders would fare differently in the post-war reckoning than those who had implemented them without question. To be the man who had saved Germany's industrial infrastructure from Hitler's final madness would be a powerful narrative at a future trial. It would position Speer as someone who had transcended his role as Nazi administrator and achieved something approaching moral clarity at the last possible moment. Whether Speer was conscious of this calculation, or whether his actions flowed from a genuine moral conviction, remains one of the most contested questions in the historical scholarship about his life. The evidence suggests it was likely both, a genuine opposition to mass destruction, combined with a very rational awareness of how that opposition could serve his interests. The military situation that surrounded all of this was almost surreal in its speed and finality. In the first weeks of March, the German front was still holding in places. By the end of the month, it had largely dissolved. American forces were crossing into Bavaria. Soviet armies had already begun the assault on Berlin itself. The government apparatus was fragmenting into competing fiefdoms, with various Nazi leaders attempting to secure their own survival through secret negotiations with the Western Allies. Speer was among them. He had begun cultivating contacts with Swedish diplomats and American intelligence officers, attempting to position himself as a potential intermediary or as someone whose expertise might be valuable to whoever inherited what remained of German industrial capacity. All of this was happening in parallel with his defiance of the Nero decree. The two actions were, in some sense, part of the same strategy. Speer was simultaneously saving Germany's infrastructure and saving himself. What is sometimes overlooked in accounts of the Nero decree and Speer's response to it is that the order itself was never fully implemented anywhere in Germany. It was sabotaged, diluted, and resisted at nearly every level of the command structure. Military commanders, like those Speer visited, had their own reasons for preserving the infrastructure. They too had begun thinking about survival. Some senior officers had begun, however tentatively, to imagine a post-war world. And so the Nero decree, this final apocalyptic vision of a dictator determined to take his nation down with him, largely failed. The fact that it failed has often been attributed primarily to Speer's actions. This attribution, while containing truth, also obscures a more complex historical reality. Speer accelerated and systematized the defiance of the Nero decree, but he did not single-handedly prevent its implementation. The order was resisted by a network of people acting from a mixture of motives, some moral, some purely pragmatic, many a blend of both. In his later testimony at Nuremberg, Speer would present this final weeks as a moment of triumph. He had defied the Führer. He had saved the German people from annihilation. He had sacrificed his closeness to Hitler for a higher duty. This narrative was compelling, and it was not entirely false, but it was also, in crucial respects, incomplete. It emphasized the one moment when Speer had stood against Hitler without acknowledging the years of complicity and compromise that preceded it. It presented Speer as a man of principle in his final act, without grappling with the fact that he had only discovered this principle at the moment when obedience had become dangerous, and when his own survival was at stake. It is one of the peculiarities of Speer's life that his single most defensible act, his defiance of the Nero decree, was also the act that most carefully served his own interests. Whether this makes it less defensible or merely human is a question on which historians continue to disagree. By the first week of May 1945, the war was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The infrastructure that Speer had worked so frantically to preserve was in the process of being divided among the occupying powers. American troops were already moving into the Ruhr Valley, examining the factories and the industrial complex that Speer had managed through 4 years of total war. Within days, Speer would be arrested. Within weeks, he would be in custody, awaiting trial. And in the months ahead, as he prepared his defense at Nuremberg, he would have ample opportunity to reflect on these final weeks. He would tell the story of the Nero decree repeatedly, to prosecutors, to judges, to journalists, to the world. It was a story that served him well. It suggested that beneath the technocrat lay a man of conscience. It proposed that Albert Speer, given a choice between loyalty and decency, had ultimately chosen decency. What this narrative obscured was the question of whether Speer had ever truly faced such a choice earlier, when the cost of resistance would have been higher, and when the stakes were not merely his own survival, but the survival of the regime itself. By the spring of 1945, the Reich that Speer had spent 12 years reshaping existed primarily in the memories of those who had built it. The Soviet armies were grinding toward Berlin from the east, their columns advancing through the rubble of cities that German industry had once supplied. The Americans and British were crossing the Rhine from the west, moving through landscapes whose infrastructure Speer had ordered preserved against Hitler's insistence on destruction. The bunker system beneath Berlin, the Führer bunker and its surrounding command complexes, had become not the nerve center of a functioning state, but the tomb of a dying man and his courtiers. Speer, at 40 years old, no longer resembled the confident architect who had once redesigned a continent. He was gaunt, exhausted by years of 16-hour workdays, his face creased with the recognition that the final reckoning was approaching. Yet he continued to move between the bunker and the outer world, his access to Hitler still absolute, his authority in the rubble of the Armaments ministry still nominally intact. The contrast was profound. Outside, the machinery of total war was collapsing into silence. Inside, a handful of loyalists clung to a delusional routine of meetings and orders that no longer reached any army or factory. Speer's last documented entry into the Führer bunker occurred in the final days of the war, though historians have never precisely dated the moment. He descended the concrete stairs into the maze of corridors that had been dug deep below the Reich Chancellery gardens, passing through checkpoints where SS guards recognized him immediately. The bunker was cold and artificial, lit by electric bulbs that created a pallid, unchanging light, regardless of whether it was day or night above. The air was stale, recycled through filters that could not entirely suppress the smell of human habitation, fear, and desperation. Speer moved through these corridors as a ghost, moving through a house he had designed, but could no longer inhabit. He encountered Bormann, Hitler's secretary, who viewed him with unconcealed suspicion. Bormann had spent years undercutting Speer's authority, and now, in the bunker's final hours, the balance of influence had subtly shifted. He saw generals and adjutants moving with the frantic energy of men trying to execute meaningless orders, and officers arriving with reports of collapsed fronts and disintegrating armies. The bunker contained perhaps 200 people at its height. Hitler and Eva Braun, his staff, guards, doctors, cooks, and a handful of the regime's surviving leaders. It was not a command center anymore, but a stage set where the final act of a tragedy was being performed for an audience of true believers and men too frightened to leave. When Speer finally gained access to Hitler, he found a man in advanced physical decline, trembling, hunched, his eyes sunken and unfocused. The Führer who had once captivated Speer with his charismatic vision was now a wraith, animated by rage and sedatives, administered by his personal physician. Speer brought with him the knowledge that he had deliberately sabotaged the Nero decree, that he had traveled to the Western Front and ordered military commanders to disobey Hitler's explicit orders to destroy all German infrastructure rather than let it fall to the Allies. This was the action that would later become the centerpiece of Speer's post-war narrative, the moment he had finally resisted, finally defied the Führer, finally stepped across the line from complicity to active opposition. Whether Speer genuinely confessed this sabotage to Hitler in the bunker, or whether he invented the confession afterward as a way of manufacturing a final act of heroism, remains one of the deepest ambiguities in his life. Speer himself claimed he told Hitler that he had issued orders to the field commanders to ignore the Nero decree, that he had preserved German industry against Hitler's demand for its destruction. According to Speer's own account, Hitler received this confession in silence, not with rage, not with orders for Speer's execution, but with a kind of weary acceptance that even his architect had abandoned him. The truth of this moment is unknowable. No other person who was in the bunker that night ever confirmed that Speer made such a confession, though several recorded that Speer was present. Hitler's adjutants, who survived the bunker's final hours, left no record of the conversation, and many of those who might have witnessed it perished within days. What is certain is that Speer left the bunker with his life, his liberty, and the beginnings of a narrative that would protect him in the catastrophe he knew was coming. Whether he had actually disobeyed the Nero decree in any meaningful way was secondary to the fact that he could claim to have done so. The order had been issued in the final weeks of the war, and Speer had indeed toured the Western Front, and he had indeed made statements suggesting that German industry should be preserved. But many other factors had ensured that the decree was never fully implemented. The speed of the Allied advance, the breakdown of command structure, the reluctance of military commanders to carry out orders that served no military purpose. Speer's action, if it had occurred as claimed, was one factor among many in an already disintegrating system. Yet by framing it as a personal act of sabotage, as a climactic moment of defiance, Speer was constructing the narrative that would define his post-war survival. He left Berlin for the last time in the final week of the war, moving northward toward the collapsing Northern Front, where Admiral Dönitz was establishing a provisional government. Speer's movements during these final days are documented in fragmentary accounts. He was intercepted by British forces. He was questioned about his whereabouts and his role. He was arrested as a matter of course, along with hundreds of other Nazi officials who were swept up as the armies advanced. The arrest was almost casual, not the dramatic seizure of a war criminal, but the routine processing of a man in a Nazi uniform at a time when the Nazi state had ceased to exist. Speer, in accounts he gave later, described a sense of relief at being removed from the unbearable tension of the final weeks. The Reich was dissolving around him. On the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. Speer learned of the surrender in detention, understanding with absolute clarity that his life, as he had known it, had ended. The architecture was gone, not yet physically destroyed in most cases, but rendered meaningless by the regime's collapse. The power was gone. The intimacy with Hitler was gone. What remained was his life, his memory, and the story he would tell about himself. The physical collapse of the Reich was staggering in its speed and completeness. The magnificent buildings that Speer had designed or overseen, the Reich Chancellery, the new Parliament building, the monumental structures rising across Berlin, still stood in the rubble of the city, but they were now meaningless shells, waiting for demolition or repurposing by the victors. The plans for Germania, the grand capital that was to be a world monument to Nazi power, existed only as drawings in abandoned offices and in Speer's memory. The labor that had built these structures, the forced workers, the concentration camp prisoners, the conscripted millions from across occupied Europe, had either died in the system that Speer had administered or been liberated by Allied armies. The factories that had produced the weapons of war under Speer's rationalized system were either bombed into rubble or occupied by foreign soldiers. The armaments miracle that had made Speer famous across the world was revealed to be exactly what it had been, a surge in weapons production that had merely prolonged a war Germany could not win, that had consumed resources and lives and labor to no strategic purpose. Speer's greatest achievement had been to keep the machinery of destruction functioning longer than would otherwise have been possible. Whether that constituted a contribution to history or a crime against humanity was the question that would occupy him for the next 36 years. Among the accounts of the bunker's final days that survived the war were testimonies from those who had been present during the regime's death throes. Hitler's valet, several adjutants, and various staff members provided descriptions of the atmosphere in those final hours. The mixture of denial and despair, the drinking, the confused conversations about where the Führer might escape to, the preparation of suicide capsules, the awareness that the end was imminent, but a strange inability to quite accept it. Speer's presence in these accounts is secondary. He appears as one figure among several, neither the closest confidant nor one of the periphery figures, but someone whose relationship with Hitler had persisted until nearly the very end. What none of these accounts describe is a dramatic moment of confrontation, a scene of Speer boldly telling Hitler that he had sabotaged the Nero decree and accepting Hitler's response with quiet dignity. That scene, if it occurred, left no trace in the historical record, except in Speer's own post-war narrative. This absence of corroboration, this silence in every other account, would become one of the central tensions in assessing Speer's post-war claims. Did the confession happen? Did Speer remember it differently than it actually occurred? Did he construct it from fragments of actual conversations into a complete narrative of defiance? The answers would matter profoundly to historians, trying to understand not just what Speer had done during the Nazi era, but what he had done to his own memory afterward. The Soviet forces entered Berlin on the 2nd of May, 1945, less than a week after Speer's presumed last meeting with Hitler. The fighting in the city was intense and destructive, but the Soviet soldiers were not primarily interested in preserving German architecture. They were interested in capturing enemy combatants and taking control of the city. The bunker system, where Hitler and his inner circle had sheltered, was penetrated and occupied. Hitler himself had taken his own life, along with Eva Braun, on the 30th of April. Their bodies burned in the garden above the bunker. according to Hitler's final instructions. By the time Soviet forces reached the bunker, Hitler and the immediate circle around him were already dead. Speer was not there to witness this final dissolution. He was already in Allied captivity, moved from place to place as the military authorities sorted through the thousands of captured Nazi officials and attempted to determine who was responsible for what. The regime that Speer had served had simply ceased to exist, not with a bang, but with the suicide of the man at its center and the chaos of an occupying army moving through the ruins of a city. The surreality of the bunker's collapse, as experienced by those who were there, was difficult to convey in straightforward language. Officers gave orders to forces that no longer existed. Hitler issued commands that would never be carried out. A government that still considered itself the legitimate authority of Germany occupied a few hundred square meters of concrete underground, while Soviet, American, and British armies divided the country above them. Time seemed to operate differently down there. Days of routine, punctuated by moments of frantic activity and despair, no natural light, no connection to the reality of the war raging above, except through radio reports of collapsing fronts. For Speer, who had spent so much of his life constructing order, designing buildings, organizing production, imposing rational systems on chaos, the experience of watching order dissolve completely must have been particularly disorienting. The architect who had dreamed of reshaping human society according to aesthetic and organizational principles was forced to witness his dreams dissolve in the space of a few weeks. More troubling still, perhaps, was the recognition that his own organizational genius had merely prolonged the catastrophe, that his rationalizations and efficiency improvements had kept the machinery of the regime functioning when it might otherwise have collapsed sooner, potentially sparing millions of lives. Speer's capture by British forces in early May was almost bureaucratic in its ordinariness. He was detained, questioned, and incorporated into the system of prisoner processing that the Allies had established for captured Nazi officials. His name was recorded. His background and positions were documented. He was moved to various camps and detention centers, where he was held with other members of the Nazi leadership, some of whom he knew well, others who were near strangers. The transition from absolute power to absolute powerlessness was not gradual for Speer, but instantaneous. One moment, he was a man with authority to order the movement of millions, to determine the allocation of resources across an entire economy, to speak directly to the Führer with certainty of access. The next moment, he was a prisoner with no authority over his own fate, subject to the decisions of military officers and lawyers from nations he had spent years treating as enemies. The psychological adjustment to this reversal was probably not as simple as Speer later suggested in his memoirs. He presents himself as accepting the defeat with equanimity, even relief, as if he had been waiting for rescue from a nightmare. But the reality of adjusting to captivity and the knowledge that trial and possibly execution awaited him must have been far more complex. What Speer carried into captivity was his memory and his ability to tell stories. He had spent his life persuading others, persuading Hitler to adopt his architectural visions, persuading industrial leaders to accept his production methods, persuading the Nazi Party faithful that his rationalizations were compatible with their ideological goals. Now, he would use those same skills to persuade the Allied lawyers and judges that his role in the Nazi regime had been more limited than the evidence suggested, that he had been a technocrat rather than a true believer, that his ignorance of the worst crimes was genuine rather than willful, that he had even resisted in the end. The performance was about to begin, the most consequential performance of his life. The bunker had been the stage for the final act of the Nazi Reich. Now the courtroom at Nuremberg would be the stage for the final act of Albert Speer's own carefully managed self-presentation. What happened in those few final days in Berlin? What was actually said between Speer and Hitler? What Speer genuinely knew and did not know would recede into the past, replaced by the narrative Speer would construct and refine over decades, a narrative that historians would spend the rest of the 20th century trying to penetrate and dismantle. The architecture of denial, more elaborate and carefully constructed than any of the buildings Speer had designed, was about to be erected. The courtroom at Nuremberg occupies the Palace of Justice, a stone building in Bavaria that the Allied armies have repurposed into the theater of the most ambitious trial in human history. 22 defendants sit in the dock, arranged on two-tiered wooden benches. In November of 1945, as the trial opens, the men wear dark suits provided by their captors. Some look diminished without uniforms, without the trappings of rank and power that once made them monumental. Hermann Göring, the former commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's chosen successor, dominates the front row with the bearing of a man who has not yet accepted defeat. Rudolf Hess sits nearby, and further along are the others: Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister; Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the general staff; Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who ran the Gestapo. The charge against them is the same: crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, war crimes. 80,000 people die every day in the Pacific Theater, while these men await trial in relative comfort. The war in Europe has been over for 6 months. Something in the world requires an accounting, and this courtroom is where civilization will attempt to provide it. Albert Speer sits on the second bench, slightly apart from the others. He is not yet 41 years old. Compared to the gaunt Hess or the bloated Göring, Speer appears almost healthy, even refined. He wears his suit with a tailor's precision, and his hair is carefully combed. He takes notes as the proceedings unfold. He listens intently to the testimony. To the casual observer from the gallery, he does not appear to be a man defending himself against accusations of genocide. He appears to be a man observing his own trial with scholarly detachment. This is not an accident. Speer has made a decision about how to survive the post-war world, and that decision has nothing to do with the justice or injustice of the proceedings. It is, fundamentally, a decision about narrative. He will not deny his role in the Reich. He will not invoke torture or coercion as his defense. He will not, like Göring, assert that he was following orders or that the charges are Victor's justice. Instead, Speer will do something far more sophisticated. He will admit to the crime of the regime while maintaining that he personally did not commit it. The prosecution builds its case methodically. The chief American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, opens with a speech that lays out the allegations against each man in turn. When Jackson reaches Speer, the focus is narrow and precise: the use of forced labor in the armaments industry. The prosecution presents documents, requisitions signed by Speer, minutes from meetings in which he requests workers from Fritz Sokol, the man responsible for conscripting millions across occupied Europe. A witness, Ferdinand Porsche, testifies that he discussed labor conditions with Speer at his factories. Another witness, a foreman from one of the tank production plants, describes the skeletal condition of the prisoners assigned to his workshop. The prosecution also introduces evidence regarding the stone quarries that supplied material for the Great Hall and the Germania project, concentration camp inmates working at the SS-controlled German earth and stone works, known as DEST, an organization that Speer's building program had effectively created demand for. The documents are arranged in chronological order, building a web of connection between Speer's decisions and the suffering they produced. Yet the prosecution faces a particular difficulty with Speer that it does not face with Göring or Kaltenbrunner. Speer himself does not deny the facts. He admits he received the workers. He admits he knew they came from occupied territories. He admits he was present at meetings where labor conditions were discussed, but he maintains, with extraordinary consistency, that he did not know the true conditions of their servitude, and that he did not know about the death camps. The testimony regarding the Posen meeting in October of 1943 becomes crucial to the prosecution's case. At this gathering, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the SS, gave a speech to senior Nazi officials in which he explicitly described the extermination of European Jewry. The speech was recorded. Transcripts exist. Speer was present. When confronted with the transcript, Speer's response is remarkable in its consistency. He claims he was not actually listening to Himmler. He states that he was distracted, perhaps thinking of production quotas or architectural plans. He says he did not hear the words that multiple other witnesses in the room confirm were spoken. He does not deny that Himmler said these things. He denies that he, Speer, heard them or registered their significance. It is a claim that transforms the trial into something more than a legal proceeding. It becomes a test of what a man can reasonably maintain in the face of contradictory evidence, and how far his politeness and composure can carry him. What distinguishes Speer's defense from that of the other defendants is his willingness to perform contrition. Göring is defiant, sometimes mocking, casting himself as a soldier who followed his orders and his conscience. Ribbentrop is evasive and bitter, claiming ignorance of the regime's worst crimes. Kaltenbrunner attempts to distance himself from the Gestapo's brutality, even as his name appears on execution orders. But Speer, in the witness stand, presents himself as genuinely troubled by what he is learning about the regime he served. When confronted with photographs of concentration camps, he shifts visibly. When given testimony about the conditions under which forced workers labored, he expresses what appears to be genuine horror that such things occurred without his knowledge or approval. He accepts what he calls collective responsibility. He states that as a senior official in the Reich, he bears moral responsibility for the regime's actions, even those he did not personally order or directly oversee. This is a calculated position. By accepting abstract moral responsibility while denying specific criminal knowledge, Speer occupies a middle ground between the defiance of Göring and the craven denial of men like Ribbentrop. He becomes, paradoxically, the most sympathetic figure in the dock. The prosecution struggles with this paradox. Jackson's team possesses overwhelming evidence of Speer's involvement in forced labor. They can place him at meetings where Sarkel discussed recruitment methods. They can show that he requested additional workers even as reports of brutal conditions accumulated. They can demonstrate that he visited factories where concentration camp prisoners worked. Yet they cannot prove that Speer knew about the death camps, the industrial extermination of the Jews. They cannot produce a document in which Speer explicitly acknowledges the Holocaust. And in 1945, the international legal system has not yet developed a category that quite captures what Speer did. Remaining in a position of power, benefiting from a system of mass coerced labor, requesting that system's output, knowing that system contained elements of brutal enslavement, while claiming ignorance of the system's innermost horror. The law eventually develops words for this: complicity, negligent knowledge, willful blindness. But at Nuremberg, in 1945 and 1946, those distinctions are not yet fully formed. The defense strategy employed by Speer's lawyer, Hans Flexner, is to separate the man from the regime. Flexner presents Speer as a technician, an expert in production and building, whose domain was technical rather than political. When Speer took over as Minister of Armaments, Flexner argues, he inherited a system already in place. The labor recruitment was handled by Saukel. The conditions of that labor were the responsibility of the military and the SS. Speer's role was to maximize output from the resources provided to him. This argument is not entirely false. One Sokol did handle formal recruitment, and Speer did not directly run the camps. But it collapses under scrutiny, because Speer was not a passive recipient of labor. He requested it. He demanded it. He complained when the numbers were insufficient. He was aware that Sokol was conscripting workers from occupied territories, many of them unwillingly. The documents make this clear. Yet throughout the trial, Speer manages to maintain the posture of a man who was absorbed in technical problems and somehow failed to register the moral dimensions of the system he was directing. The most telling moment in the trial comes when Speer is asked directly whether he read reports of conditions in concentration camps. He says he did not. He is shown a report from one of his own inspection visits to a factory that employed concentration camp prisoners. The report describes the workers as skeletal, malnourished, diseased. Speer is asked if he saw this report. He says that even if he did not read it carefully. He says he was focused on production. He says he trusted that the camps were being run according to regulations. Each of these claims is technically defensible. A man can claim he did not read a document, can claim he did not register its contents. But taken together, they form a pattern of profound willfulness. They paint a picture of a man who constructed his own ignorance with as much precision as he constructed the buildings that bore his name. Yet his politeness, his apparent willingness to engage with the questions, his refusal to bluster or threaten, these things work in his favor with the judges and increasingly with observers in the gallery and the international press. The trial proceeds through the winter of 1945 and into 1946. Testimony accumulates. Witnesses describe the conditions in factories, the death rates among forced workers, the selection processes by which prisoners were assigned to production plants. The prosecution builds a meticulous case, yet with each piece of evidence, Speer responds with the same quiet demurral. He did not know. He was not responsible. He was focused on production. He trusted his subordinates. He bears collective responsibility, but not individual guilt. His composure becomes almost superhuman. Other defendants occasionally break. Stryker, the vicious publisher of anti-Semitic propaganda, is contemptuous and hostile. Keitel, the general, wavers between compliance and rage. But Speer sits and listens and takes notes and performs the role of a man discovering, for the first time, the full horror of the regime he served. The effect is remarkably effective. In the gallery, journalists begin to describe him as the most rational defendant, the one most capable of honest reckoning, the one most likely to emerge with some semblance of redemption. His earlier claims of nobility, the resistance to the Nero decree, the refusal to poison Hitler, the attempts to protect Berlin's workers, these stories circulate and acquire weight through repetition. By the time the closing arguments are delivered, Speer has succeeded in reframing the trial. The question is no longer, did Speer benefit from and encourage a system of mass enslavement? The question has become, is Speer guilty of the specific crimes alleged? And was he truly aware of the Holocaust? These are narrower questions, and Speer has positioned himself to survive them. The prosecution demands death for Speer, arguing that the evidence of forced labor is overwhelming, and that his position in the armaments ministry made him complicit in the suffering of millions. But the judges, 3 years removed from the victory in Europe, and now engaged in building a new order, seem to have reached a different conclusion. They are looking at a man who accepts responsibility while maintaining innocence, who performs remorse while denying guilt. They are looking at a man who may represent a way forward, the educated Nazi who was misled, who admits the system was wrong, but who cannot be proven to have personally engaged in the worst crimes. The verdict comes on the 1st of October, 1946. Of the 22 defendants, 12 are sentenced to death. They include Göring, Ribbentrop, Kaltenbrunner, and Keitel. But Speer is not among them. Instead, he is sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. The decision shocks many observers. The evidence of forced labor seems sufficient for execution. The fact that Sauckel is also tried separately and executed, while Speer, who requested the workers Sauckel provided, is spared, appears to many to be a judicial inconsistency. Yet the judges have made a calculation. Speer is younger than most of the defendants. He may have a future beyond the Reich. He has cooperated with the court. He has not been proven to have knowledge of the final solution. He is, in short, salvageable, in a way that Göring and the others are not. As Speer stands to hear his sentence, his expression does not change. He has already begun the next chapter of his narrative. Prison, he will soon discover, is a place where a man can write, can think, can reconstruct his story for a post-war world that may yet forgive him. The trial is over. The real work of rehabilitation can begin. The courtroom fell silent as the judges entered on the morning of the 1st of October, 1946. The Nuremberg tribunal had deliberated for weeks, sifting through the evidence of 2 decades of Nazi domination, and now the verdicts came down like sentences from history itself. One by one, the accused stood to hear their fate. Hermann Göring received the death sentence, and with it, a kind of vindication. The man who had always presented himself as the Führer's right hand would die as the Führer's martyr. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, also death. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the SS police chief, death. The roll call of execution continued, relentless, each verdict a closing of accounts. And then Albert Speer heard his own sentence, 20 years, not death. 20 years of imprisonment in a cell, but 20 years of survival, and for a man who had spent the entire trial performing remorse with meticulous care, survival was precisely what he had engineered. The shock rippled through the gallery. Prosecutors and observers alike struggled to reconcile the evidence they had heard with the leniency of the verdict. The forced labor case against Speer was formidable. Documentary proof of his requests to Fritz Sauckel for millions of workers, minutes of meetings where the conditions of their conscription were discussed with clinical frankness, testimony from those who had worked in his factories under conditions that amounted to enslavement. One British prosecutor had argued with conviction that Speer's knowledge and his demands made him culpable not merely for administration, but for the systematic dehumanization that underpinned it. The evidence was there, layered in the trial records, undeniable in its specificity. Yet the judges had chosen mercy, or at least a lesser punishment. Historians would debate for decades whether Speer's cooperative demeanor in the dock, his willingness to accept collective responsibility, even as he denied personal knowledge of the worst crimes, had made him seem less monstrous than Göring's defiance or Himmler's suicide. Perhaps his education and his evident intelligence persuaded the tribunal that he was salvageable in a way that other defendants were not. Perhaps his careful distinction between the system and his role within it had lodged itself in the minds of men who wanted to believe in the possibility of redemption even within this catastrophe. Speer was transferred to Spandau military prison in West Berlin in the autumn of 1946, a fortress that would become his home for the next 2 decades. 6 other defendants went with him. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer who had flown to Scotland in 1941 on a bizarre peace mission and been imprisoned ever since. Baldur von Schirach, the Hitler youth leader, Karl Dönitz, the admiral who had briefly served as Hitler's successor, Konstantin von Neurath, the elderly diplomat, Albert Kesselring, the field marshal, and Erich Raeder, another admiral. The prison itself was administered jointly by the four Allied powers, each commanding for a month in rotation: British, American, Soviet, French. A rotating authority that meant the rules changed with each monthly transition. For Speer, this would prove to be both constraint and opportunity. The routine was austere and strictly observed. Each prisoner was assigned a cell, given labor to perform, permitted limited exercise in the yard, and forbidden from any communication with the outside world, except through letters that were heavily censored. The guards were rotated constantly to prevent the formation of bonds or sympathies. The food was meager but adequate. The cold was intense, particularly during winter, for Spandau was an old fortress with poor heating. And yet, within this rigid structure, a man with Speer's mind and determination could work. From the very beginning of his imprisonment, Speer understood with perfect clarity what he needed to do. He had 20 years before him, and he could either spend them in despair, like Hess, who would eventually lose his sanity, or he could use them as he had used everything else in his life. As an instrument of will and reconstruction, he began to write. Not openly, for writing was restricted, but secretly, smuggling his notes out through channels that he developed with extraordinary patience. A Dutch diplomat named Jan Colijn began visiting the prison, ostensibly to observe conditions, but in reality to serve as Speer's conduit to the outside world. Into Collijn's hands went page after page of careful handwriting, notes reconstructed from memory in the evenings in his cell, observations about his time in the Third Reich, rendered in increasingly literary prose. Speer worked with the precision of a man composing not merely a memoir, but a defense. Each paragraph was calculated. Each recollection was positioned to support a narrative of seduction rather than conviction, of complicity born from aesthetic intoxication rather than moral corruption. He was not inventing these memories. Many were genuine, but he was selecting them with absolute deliberation, choosing which moments to illuminate and which to leave in shadow. The peculiar society of Spandau prison became, in a strange way, a laboratory for Speer's self-fashioning. Rudolf Hess, who had once been the Führer's closest lieutenant, spent his years in the cell next to Speer's, in a state of progressive dissociation. Hess would shuffle through the exercise yard muttering to himself, his mind fragmenting under the weight of confinement, and he would eventually come to believe that there were spies inserting poisonous substances into his food. Von Schirach, the Hitler youth leader, proved to be surprisingly willing to acknowledge the evil of the regime in straightforward terms, without equivocation or self-exculpation. And Dönitz, the admiral, maintained a dignified silence, accepting his sentence without the elaborate self-justifications that many of the others constructed. Speer observed all of this with the cold, analytical eye of a man taking notes for history. He read extensively, theology, philosophy, biography, and he thought with the kind of discipline that most men lack. In many ways, his 2 decades in Spandau were not a punishment, but a retreat into exactly the kind of structured contemplation that suited his temperament. He had time to think, to write, to refine his narrative. The prison walls were not a cage so much as a studio in which he could compose the version of himself that he wished to present to the world. The forced labor question haunted the prison, though not in the way it might have. Among the other prisoners, there was an understanding, sometimes explicit and sometimes tacit, that they had all been swept up in forces larger than themselves, that they had all made compromises, that they had all found ways to live with what they had done. Von Neurath, the elderly diplomat, had written a letter to the tribunal, claiming that he had been merely a figurehead, that others had made the real decisions, a defense so transparent that the tribunal had seen through it. Yet the same basic logic underpinned the defense of nearly every man in Spandau. If you could convincingly argue that you had been a figurehead, that you had lacked real authority, that your orders had come from above, and your underlings had carried out the worst excesses without your knowledge, then you might survive. Speer had taken this logic further than any of the others. He had not merely claimed ignorance or lack of authority. He had claimed that his very nature as an architect and aesthete had made him incapable of seeing the human cost beneath the grand designs. He had been seduced, he maintained, by the architectural vision, by the proximity to power, by the intoxication of unlimited resources. He was not a murderer. He was not an ideologue. He was a technician who had failed to ask the right questions. The irony of Spandau, for Speer, was that his imprisonment was almost productive. While he served his sentence, the outside world was changing. West Germany was rebuilding, becoming prosperous, and it was hungry for a narrative that made sense of the Nazi past, a narrative that allowed for the possibility that even senior Nazis could be men of cultivation and conscience, that the era had not been monolithic evil, but a tragic seduction of an entire people. And Speer, through his notes smuggled out with Kollinger's assistance, was constructing exactly that narrative. His Spandau diaries would eventually run to nearly 500 pages, a document that read like a carefully composed memoir rather than the fragmentary notes of a man in prison. In his cell, Speer had become a writer and a historian as much as a prisoner, and he had the enormous advantage of being able to revise, edit, and shape his account before it ever reached the public. Other men in Spandau were also writing. Hess, in his confused way, Dönitz, with military precision, but none of them had Speer's purpose or his literary skill. The relationships within the prison, as documented by the guards, and by the prisoners themselves in their occasional aloud letters, took on a kind of complex choreography. Speer and Hess occupied adjacent cells, yet they rarely spoke. Hess was descending into paranoia and psychological collapse, and Speer maintained a careful distance, neither sympathetic nor cruel, simply absent from Hess's deteriorating reality. With von Schirach, Speer was more cordial, sharing intellectual discussions about art and philosophy during the permitted exercise periods. But even these conversations were calculated. Speer was always aware that he was being observed, that guards were watching and listening, that any word he spoke might eventually surface in a report or in someone's memoir. He lived as if he were composing for history, even within the prison. The British guards, who were often sympathetic to him, he was, after all, educated and articulate, unlike some of the other defendants, would occasionally allow him small privileges, an extra book from the prison library, a moment of conversation that the regulations technically forbade. Speer cultivated these small kindnesses with precision, never pushing too far, always maintaining the bearing of a man unjustly imprisoned, but accepting his sentence with stoicism. The physical toll of 2 decades in Spandau would have broken most men. The cold, the monotony, the loss of freedom, the knowledge that the world outside was moving on without you, these were instruments of slow psychological destruction. And yet Speer adapted. He was assigned various prison jobs, which he performed with characteristic efficiency. He worked in the garden, even in the harsh Berlin winters, and he somehow made the experience productive, introducing what he called improvements to the cultivation methods. He was not trying to escape, nor was he trying to make the best of a bad situation in the way that ordinary prisoners do. Rather, he was using every moment of his confinement as material for his composition. Each experience in Spandau became a scene that could be rendered in his memoir, each interaction with guards or fellow prisoners an opportunity to deepen his portrait. of a man learning humility through imprisonment. By the 1950s, as Speer approached the midpoint of his sentence, the external world had begun to shift in ways that would ultimately serve him well. The Cold War had polarized international attention away from the crimes of the Nazi past and toward the threat of Soviet communism. In the West, there was a growing impulse to rehabilitate Germany, to make it an ally against the Soviet Union, and to move past the recriminations of the war years. In this atmosphere, the figure of Albert Speer, a man serving his sentence, writing thoughtfully about his experience, seemingly accepting guilt while offering a more nuanced account than simple demonization, began to appear valuable in a different way. He represented the possibility of a Nazi past that could be acknowledged, understood, and ultimately transcended. Letters began to arrive at Spandau from the outside, from historians, from journalists, from intellectuals curious about his account of the era. The censors allowed some through. Through these communications, Speer maintained a careful connection to the world, always positioning himself as a man of conscience and reflection. The relationships among the prisoners deepened and changed as the years accumulated. Dönitz, the admiral, was released in 1956 after serving 10 years of his 10-year sentence, his dignity intact and his silence preserved. And in 1960, after serving 14 years, Konstantin von Neurath was released on grounds of poor health, leaving behind only a handful of men. But it was the absence of others that mattered more to Speer than their presence. As the 1960s approached, the surviving prisoners in Spandau included Speer, Hess, von Schirach, and Raeder, men who had been condemned to long sentences and who faced many more years within those walls. For Speer, the knowledge that he would be among the last to leave was a kind of vindication. He was not going to be released as a concession to age or health. He would serve his full 20 years, and in serving them, he would complete his transformation from architect to penitent, from administrator of the system to its chronicler and confessor. The secret manuscript that Speer was composing during these years would become the foundation of everything that followed. The pages smuggled out through Colline were being carefully preserved and typed, creating a growing archive of Speer's account of the Third Reich. He was writing with the knowledge that this work would eventually be published, that it would be his primary legacy, and that it would need to withstand the scrutiny of historians and the judgment of the public. And so he wrote with precision and care, crafting sentences that were clear and persuasive, selecting details that would illuminate his essential narrative, while omitting or minimizing those that would contradict it. He was, in the peculiar freedom of his cell, creating the version of Albert Speer that he wished to present to history. When he finally walked out of Spandau in October 1966, having served his full 20 years, it would not be as a broken man seeking redemption, but as a writer who had spent 2 decades constructing a narrative of seduction, complicity, and reluctant wisdom, and who believed, with some justification, that he had prepared the world to receive it. Behind the grey walls of Spandau prison in Berlin, in a cell measuring no more than 3 meters by 4, Albert Speer began a project that would reshape his entire legacy. It was 1946 when he arrived, freshly sentenced to 20 years, and the man who had orchestrated the grandest architectural visions of the Nazi state now faced the smallest possible space. A cell with a narrow bed, a desk, and time stretching ahead in a landscape of regulated days. Unlike many of his fellow prisoners, Speer did not rage against his confinement or appeal his verdict. Instead, he began to write. With no official permission, using materials smuggled in by sympathetic guards and a Dutch diplomat named Walcott Carroll, who would visit regularly, Speer started reconstructing his memories of the Third Reich in careful, meticulous prose. He filled notebook after notebook with observations about his fellow prisoners, his reflections on power and ambition, and his version of the history he had lived through. These notes, written in the margins of his captivity, would become the foundation stones upon which his entire post-war reputation would be built. The act of writing in Spandau was itself an exercise in control and calculation. Speer knew that his words might someday be published, that historians would scrutinize every line, that his survival as a free man depended partly on the narrative he constructed while still imprisoned. He wrote with literary care, crafting sentences that balanced confession with self-justification, acknowledging the regime's crimes while maintaining his own essential separation from them. His prose was educated and reflective, the writing of a man of taste and cultivation, which itself became part of his strategy. A man who writes this well, his future readers would think, cannot be truly evil. A man who grapples with moral complexity in such articulate terms must be fundamentally different from the crude ideologues around him. Every paragraph was an argument for his own partial innocence, delivered not through blunt denial, but through the careful architecture of narrative itself. The diaries never shriek or defend themselves aggressively. They insinuate, they suggest, they leave strategic silences where other voices might fill in the gaps. What is remarkable about these smuggled pages is not what Speer chose to include, but what he systematically omitted. Nearly 500 pages were eventually smuggled out and hidden, yet they contain almost no discussion of forced labor, despite the fact that Speer had repeatedly requested workers from Fritz Sauckel, despite the fact that he knew these workers came from occupied territories under conditions amounting to enslavement, despite the fact that his own factories depended on this labor system to meet their production quotas. When forced labor appears in the diaries at all, it is treated as a technical problem, a matter of logistics, something that happened in the factories, but not something that Speer himself orchestrated or morally reckoned with. Similarly, the diaries maintain an almost complete silence on the Holocaust itself. Speer writes extensively about his relationship with Hitler, about architectural dreams, about the personalities of other Nazi leaders, about his illness in 1943, and his sense of political isolation. But the machinery of genocide, the fact that millions of people were being systematically murdered, even as he administered the industrial capacity of the state, barely registers in these pages. This is not because Speer forgot. It is because Speer chose, with precision, what he would remember and what he would leave in strategic shadow. The historical record from Spandau shows that Speer was aware of exactly what he was doing. Other prisoners would later testify that Speer discussed his writing with them, that he had a clear sense of shaping a narrative for future consumption. One fellow inmate noted that Speer would sometimes revise passages, clearly thinking about how they would be received. The diaries were not the spontaneous outpouring of a guilty conscience unburdening itself. They were a carefully constructed argument being made across years, smuggled out page by page, designed to present Albert Speer to the world as a man who had been ambitious, who had been blinded by proximity to power, who had perhaps not asked enough questions, but who was fundamentally different from the ideological fanatics around him. The absence of forced labor discussion in these pages is not innocent. The silence regarding the Holocaust is not accidental. Speer was constructing his defense while still behind bars, writing his way toward the story he would tell for the rest of his life. A story that would eventually earn him international sympathy, book deals, speaking engagements, and the status of a thoughtful elder statesman reflecting on his own complicity. Walcott Carroll, the Dutch diplomat who facilitated the smuggling, became essential to this operation. Carroll would visit Spandau as part of his official duties, and Speer would pass him notebooks written in his precise, disciplined hand. Carroll would hide these notebooks and eventually deliver them to Speer's former secretary and confidant, Hjalmar Schacht's widow, though the exact chain of custody through which these pages were preserved remains somewhat obscure, which itself tells us something about how carefully Speer managed this operation. The security of Spandau prison was actually quite rigorous. The fact that Speer was able to smuggle out nearly 500 pages without detection says something about either the complicity of certain guards or the sheer sophistication of his methods. What is clear is that Speer treated the contraband diaries as a form of insurance. While he was imprisoned, his words were accumulating in the outside world, building a narrative, shaping what people would know about him before he could ever speak directly to them again. The diaries that emerged from Spandau would eventually become the basis for two major books that would define Speer's reputation for decades. The first, published in 1969, was titled Inside the Third Reich, a volume that became an international bestseller, translated into numerous languages, reprinted many times, and taught in universities as a crucial first-hand account of Nazi leadership from someone who claimed to have been an insider. The second book, published in 1975, was Spandau, The Secret Diaries, which presented the actual day-to-day entries from his prison years, the process of remembrance itself, along with his reflections on the books he was reading in Spandau, and the conversations he was having with fellow prisoners. Together, these works sold millions of copies worldwide and earned Speer substantial sums of money. They positioned him not as a war criminal awaiting justice, but as a writer, a memoirist, a historical witness of considerable literary sophistication. Publishers competed to translate his work. Reviewers praised the clarity and apparent honesty of his recollections. The books seemed to confirm everything Speer had argued at Nuremberg, that he had been seduced by power and proximity to Hitler, that he had been blind to much of what was happening around him, and that he had fundamentally different values from the true ideological believers of the regime. Yet historians who would examine these diaries decades later, comparing them against documentary evidence and against what Speer himself had written or said during other periods, began to identify patterns that suggested something more calculated than simple autobiography. Matthias Schmidt, in particular, who conducted extensive research into Speer's life, noted that the diaries omit discussions of events that Speer certainly knew about, and that he himself had documented elsewhere. Schmidt found meeting minutes in which Speer discussed forced labor quotas. He located evidence of Speer's participation in discussions about labor conditions. He traced the paper trails of requests Speer had made, of conversations he had initiated, of knowledge he clearly possessed. Yet none of this appeared in the Spandau diaries. The silence was not innocent forgetfulness. It was editorial choice. Speer had selected the memories he would share with future readers, and had left out the memories that would complicate his narrative of essential innocence. This realization, that the diaries were not a transparent record, but a carefully curated performance, would eventually undermine their authority as historical documents, though by that point, they had already shaped public understanding of Speer for an entire generation. The Posen Conference of 1943, which historians would later identify as perhaps the most incriminating moment of Speer's entire career, appears nowhere in the Spandau diaries, or appears only in the most oblique terms. At Posen, Heinrich Himmler had delivered a speech to senior Nazi officials in which he explicitly described the extermination of the Jewish people in terms that made willful ignorance virtually impossible for anyone present. Himmler spoke of the killing of millions, of the mechanism of the final solution, in language that was direct and unambiguous. Speer was present at Posen. The evidence is clear that Speer heard Himmler's words. Yet the Posen Conference and Himmler's revelations simply do not appear in Speer's account of his own life, written in Spandau. This is not a failure of memory. It is an act of deliberate erasure. By omitting Posen from his narrative, Speer removed from the historical record, or attempted to remove, the moment that most clearly contradicted his defense of ignorance. The diaries from Spandau were being written for a future audience that Speer hoped would never know about Posen, or would not connect it to his own statements of innocence. What makes the Spandau diaries so historically significant is that they represent Speer's own assessment of what he could safely admit and what he needed to deny or omit. They show his understanding of which silences would be most protective. They demonstrate that Speer, even while imprisoned, was engaged in active rehabilitation, not passively remembering, but strategically choosing what his memories would contain. The diaries became the source material for his books, which became the basis for his public interviews after his release, which shaped how he was understood by the general public, by journalists, by many historians. Once a narrative is established in this way, it becomes remarkably difficult to dislodge, even when evidence contradicts it. People are invested in their understanding of history. They resist information that complicates narratives they have already accepted. The Speer who emerged from Spandau, thoughtful, articulate, apparently remorseful, was in many ways a more effective creation than any propaganda Speer had produced during the Nazi years. He had taken the very tools of narrative control that had served him as an administrator and minister, and he had turned them inward, constructing a version of Albert Speer that would survive the war and outlive the regime. The writing in Spandau also served another purpose beyond historical narrative. It was psychologically sustaining. Speer was imprisoned for 20 years, a sentence that many of his fellow defendants did not survive. The routine of imprisonment was rigorous: shared labor duties, communal dining, restricted movement. Writing gave Speer agency within confinement. It allowed him to control something when almost everything else was controlled. It turned his cell into not just a place of punishment, but a place of creative work, of authorship. Fellow prisoners noted that Speer seemed almost content in Spandau, or at least seemed to accept his confinement with less bitterness than one might expect. One reason was that he was working, he was writing. He was already planning his future rehabilitation while still serving his sentence. The man who had always needed a grand project, who had needed Hitler's ambitious building plans, who had needed the challenge of wartime production, who had struggled when without a monumental task, found in the Spandau diaries a new project worthy of his talents. He was architecting his own post-war identity with the same precision he had once brought to the Reich Chancellery redesign. The critical insight that historians would eventually reach is that the Spandau diaries are not reliable testimony to what Speer thought or did. They are testimony to what Speer thought it was wise to claim he thought. They are not transparent autobiography, but strategic narrative construction. Every paragraph was an argument. Every omission was a choice. The man writing in that cell was not a penitent seeking forgiveness. He was a strategist working toward freedom and rehabilitation. He wrote with the knowledge that these words would eventually be read, that they would shape how he was understood, that they were his most powerful tool in the battle to survive, not just imprisonment, but history itself. The diaries from Spandau transformed a convicted war criminal into a memoirist, a man imprisoned into a man preserved in literary amber, positioned for eventual redemption. When Speer was finally released in 1966, these words had already done their work. The narrative was established. The performance of contrition had been carefully rehearsed across nearly 500 pages, written in a 3 by 4 cell. He emerged from Spandau not just as a free man, but as an author, a witness, an elder statesman of carefully managed memory. the architect of his own defense, still building, still constructing, even behind bars. Albert Speer walked out of Spandau prison on a grey morning in October 1966, an old man made older by 20 years of captivity. He was 59 years old. The war had ended more than 2 decades earlier, yet he carried with him something far more valuable than freedom. He carried the carefully constructed narrative of his own redemption, refined through countless hours in a prison cell, polished in secret writings, smuggled out piece by piece, and now ready to meet a world that had been waiting for exactly this kind of story. The guards who released him would have noticed nothing unusual in his bearing. Speer had mastered the art of the composed exit, the controlled gesture, the measured word. He had learned in the bunker how to perform for an audience of one. Now he would perform for millions. The West Germany that greeted him was unrecognizable from the rubble heap he had left behind in 1945. The currency was stable. The cities had been rebuilt. Factories hummed with productivity. Democracy had taken root in the western half of the divided nation, and the German people were engaged in what historians would later call the economic miracle, a phrase that itself carried an ironic echo of Speer's old title, the Miracle Minister. But beneath this prosperity lived a profound discomfort. The German past had not been resolved. It had merely been covered over, like a corpse hastily buried. The nation needed a story it could tell itself, about how such civilized people had done such uncivilized things. It needed permission to move forward. And it needed a figure who could embody that permission, someone who had been close to power, who acknowledged wrongdoing in sufficiently vague terms, but who was above all educated, articulate, and capable of explaining how good intentions had been corrupted by circumstances. Into this vacancy stepped Albert Speer. His first book, which would bear the English title Inside the Third Reich, had been gestating throughout his time in Spandau, built from those smuggled pages, from thousands of hours of reflection, and from conversations with fellow prisoners who became his collaborators and witnesses. The manuscript was finished before his release, ready to be published the moment the prison gates closed behind him. It appeared in German in 1969, and within months it had been translated into English, French, and a dozen other languages. The book became a phenomenon unlike anything that had preceded it. It sold millions of copies. It was serialized across major newspapers. It won awards and was adopted as essential reading in schools. Here, at last, was the inside story, an account written by a man who had sat in Hitler's private dining room, who had seen the Führer up close, who could describe the machinery of the dictatorship from the perspective of intimate access. And the voice that told this story was measured, reflective, somewhat pained, the voice of a man who had genuinely examined his conscience and found it wanting. The brilliance of Speer's book lay not in what he revealed, but in what he carefully did not reveal. He admitted to knowledge of forced labor. He acknowledged that concentration camp prisoners had been used in his quarries. He confessed to the general brutality of the regime, but he deployed a kind of strategic vagueness about his own role within these systems. He described himself as an architect, seduced by the intoxicating power of being Hitler's favorite, by the ecstasy of building on a monumental scale, by the simple human weakness of wanting to please a man who held ultimate power. He presented himself as a technocrat, a specialist in production and efficiency, who had focused narrowly on his professional duties and allowed the moral implications of those duties to drift into a kind of background noise. He did not deny guilt, but he reframed it. He was guilty of being complicit in a system, not guilty of orchestrating its worst aspects. This was the crucial distinction. In his book, Speer emerged as someone who had failed to ask questions when he should have, who had been blind to truths he should have seen, but who had not actively participated in the specific machinery of genocide. And perhaps most importantly, he appeared to be someone who had learned from that failure, who had paid the price through imprisonment, and who could now serve as a model for Germans wrestling with their own complicity in the crimes of the Reich. The book's publication coincided with a moment of profound psychological need in West Germany. The nation was entering what would become known as the era of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the attempt to come to terms with or work through the past. The 1960s in Germany saw a generational reckoning, particularly among the young, who began asking their parents and grandparents uncomfortable questions about what they had known and done during the Nazi years. These were not abstract historical inquiries. They were personal. The trials of Nazi criminals continued through the 60s, and each trial reopened wounds that Germans were attempting to close. In this context, Speer's book offered something like a balm. Here was a Nazi leader who acknowledged that the regime had been criminal, who did not hide behind nationalism or ideology, who was willing to accept punishment and emerge from it as a wiser man. His very existence seemed to suggest that ordinary human decency could survive even in the hearts of those who had served evil, that Germans could acknowledge their history without being entirely condemned by it. The television interviews that followed the book's publication revealed Speer's mastery of a medium that he seemed born to inhabit. In a German television studio, filmed in grainy black and white, Speer sat across from interviewers with the composed demeanor of a man accustomed to speaking to the powerful. His face was lined but dignified. His voice carried weight without aggression. When asked about his relationship with Hitler, he did not defend it, but recontextualized it. He explained the Führer's charisma, the seductive pull of his vision, the way that proximity to ultimate power had clouded judgment. He never denied that he had known the regime was committing atrocities, but he drew a distinction between knowing something in the abstract, understanding, intellectually, that terrible things were happening, and witnessing them directly, and particularly from participating in the decisions that produced them. This distinction may not have been intellectually rigorous, but it was emotionally persuasive. He appeared on television as a man carrying genuine shame, yet the shame seemed manageable, survivable, redeemable through reflection and time. He had paid his price. He had served his time. Now he was offering the gift of his experience to a public hungry for understanding. The response from the international cultural establishment was remarkable. Speer was invited to lecture at universities. His work was discussed in seminars, alongside other memoirs of the era. Major newspapers and magazines featured him in long-form interviews. He became a fixture in the ecosystem of Cold War European intellectualism, a man who had been inside the totalitarian machinery and could speak with authority about how such systems function. Western intellectuals and journalists seemed almost relieved to have found a Nazi leader who was willing to engage with his own culpability in a language they understood. Speer never attempted to rehabilitate Nazism itself. He never defended the ideology or the wars or the racial theories. Instead, he offered a narrative of personal seduction and moral failure that was universal enough to be recognized by anyone who had ever compromised their principles or ignored injustice for the sake of professional advancement or personal ambition. In a society beginning to grapple with the costs of technocratic expertise divorced from ethical consideration, Speer's story seemed almost prophetic. The publishing industry, sensing the appetite for Holocaust and Nazi-era testimonies, encouraged Speer to produce more. His second book, published in the early 1970s, was a detailed architectural history of his buildings and plans, what he might have created had the war turned differently.